Hello, and welcome to this, our 110th live stream, Statues in the Mist. This is, of course, referring to our most recent Man Machine review, where we talked about the statues that were found at the spa site in Tuscany. Very interesting find. Very, very interesting find. So anyway, we're here to take your questions on ancient Egypt and the Bible. And this is what we do every Friday night at 8 p.m. So, we want to start with setting out the ground rules, which is basically super chats have priority. This is standard across all YouTube platforms. The other thing is that if you want to address a question directly to me, you need to begin the question with a Q and a colon. Otherwise, I'll assume it's just for somebody else in the live chat to basically, as sort of an open form question. Okay, but if you want to, as I say, if you want to aim it directly at me, it has to start with a Q and a colon. And I look for that. The next thing is only post your question once. If you post it multiple times, we'll just ignore the question. And then finally, if it has to do with something like a Bible verse or an ancient language, we ask that you include some context. In the case of a Bible verse, please include the book, chapter, and verse. If it has to do with an ancient language, tell me what language it's in and what you think it means. So I just don't go scrambling around. So anyway, with that said, let's get into your questions. Okay, our first question of the night. We're going to start off here with 4 non-super chats. And our first question is from Darkblade. Okay. And he asks a grammatical question. Of course, I geek out on grammatical questions. So for me, it's like, okay, I know what question I'm picking here. The one that interests me. Okay, I'll mark that off at 8:06. Okay, awesome. And so the question here is, what is the grammatical function of the prefix lamed? Now, he is obviously talking about Semitic languages here. Probably in most likelihood Hebrew. The lamed prefix, the way prepositions work in Hebrew, is oftentimes there is a single character that is attached to the front of a word, like a noun. So, in this particular case, the lamed is the dative preposition. So it means 2 or 4. So you would say, for example, we walked to Hatzor. La Hatzor. So that's what the purpose of the lamed is it's to show, say, the direction of the movement of the object. Whether it's to something or to a place or for a purpose or whatever. It's the dative construction. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciate it. And I always love a good grammar question. Okay. The next question here is from also Darkblade. I don't know. Maybe Bonbon's going to be replaced tonight by Darkblade. You think that could happen? I can probably see Bonbon right now in the live chat screaming, "No!" Okay. Hi, Bonbon. Okay, and Darkblade asks, is it possible that the Torah was originally written in Amorite? Or maybe a proto-Sinaitic transcription of it, and later translated evolved into Hebrew. Oh yeah, it's very possible. Now the thing is, one of the things we notice about Amoritic is it's really, really close to Hebrew. Really close. Down to its grammatical constructions and even some of its spelling and syntax. So the thing we discovered about Amoritic is it's a lot closer to Hebrew than anyone ever anticipated. So, given that's the case, it wouldn't have taken very much to update the language to convert it from Amoritic into Hebrew. So as long as, say, the Amoritic started with, say, an alphabetic script, which is very likely, it's very, very likely, there's no reason why it couldn't have been originally written in Amoritic and then later on updated into Hebrew. Because by that point, your typical native Hebrew speaker would have been able to would have then those subtle nuances of Hebrew that differentiate it from Amoritic. But that's just language updating. And in the case of, as I said, between those two languages, so close, that it would be very, very, how would I say it? In some ways, they're so related and so close, they could be indistinguishable in many cases. So I think it's highly possible that it was later updated into Hebrew. Very likely possible, and originally written in at least an Amoritic dialect. So, anyway, thank you very much for the question. Interesting question. I mean, the fact is, with those two Amoritic tablets, the possibilities are wide open now. I mean, there's some really interesting possibilities now for the authorship of the Torah that just didn't present itself until then. So, I mean, I think it's great that we're getting these questions now, because we can finally say, okay, we got the smoking gun. We got the smoking gun for the Hebrew language. Now, let's see how this plays out in the history of, say, textual development in Israel. So, yeah, a lot of interesting stuff's going to come out of this. Okay, our first bonbon question of the night. And he asks, what was the most interesting political palace intrigue in Egypt's history? For example, Tutmosis III using war spoils to buy off other segments of the elite and put people loyal to him to replace the courtiers. Actually, I think the most interesting piece of palace intrigue in Egypt was the harem conspiracy. That one was really interesting. The harem conspiracy involved the assassination attempt and successful assassination, we've now found out, of Ramses III. And it took place in the harem. And it basically involved Ramses III's secondary wives, particularly one named T, who wanted her son Pentawere to take the throne after his death. Okay? Now, what this conspiracy involved, was not just dispatching the old man. That was only part of it. They couldn't just get away with getting rid of the old man. They had to also get rid of the successor too, because Ramses III's successor had already been named, and that would be Ramses IV. So they had to orchestrate a two-pronged assassination attempt. So this alone is real interesting, because those sorts of things are very, very hard to pull off. Now, we know at the time that that the fortunes of Ramses III had been declining. Egypt was in a kind of a depression/recession. You know, inflation was out of control. The price of everything was going through the roof. Ramses III had lost a lot of his popularity because the price of everything had just skyrocketed. So he was not exactly the most popular ruler. So they elicited the wives elicited the help of um of, of some court officials. Probably the most notable here is um Pebekamin. He is probably the central court official behind the assassination attempt. So they arrange this thing, they scheme it, and they work out the plan, and they work out this idea that they're going to knock off the old man first, and then his son, and then they can establish Pentawere on the throne. Now, what's interesting about this is until just recently, it was debated whether or not Ramses III had actually been assassinated, if this was just an attempted assassination attempt. But examining the mummy showed that there was a knife incision that went across the throat. They don't do that in mummification. So that was a pre-mortem knife incision. So it looked like the attempt had been successful to dispatch the old man. Pre-mortem knife incision, yes. So anyway, what happened was they got rid of the old man, but the son escaped. He escaped the palace, and they tried to put Pentawere on the throne, and they couldn't establish his reign because the son was still alive, and everyone else was still loyal to him. So what happened ultimately was a whole intrigue was brought out. It's in a court proceeding in a very famous papyrus. It's called the Harem Conspiracy Papyrus. And the conspirators ended up being executed by strangulation. So, there you have it, probably the most interesting piece of court intrigue I find in Egyptian history. So, anyway, thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question, but that's what I think is the most interesting court intrigue. That assassination attempt. Okay, well. Okay, our fourth non-super chat tonight is also from Darkblade. It's a Darkblade night. Is the mention of iron in Job 28:2 evidence for an Iron Age date for the book? Okay. It's an interesting question. It's not the best evidence for it. Let's bring up the Book of Job here, because there is some interesting things in Job here. But we'll bring up the passage just to read it. We would expect that if there was a lot of iron, at least being smelted, that would definitely be Iron Age. But we do also have to understand too that that iron meteoritic iron had been used before the Iron Age as well. So, but in verse 2 it does say here, iron is taken from the dust, and from rock copper is smelted. So there is the illusion here that the iron here is being smelted. So that would be definitely indicative of the Iron Age. But there's another indicator that I think is more interesting as far as the Iron Age goes, which is the mention. There's a mention of certain people groups here, like the Sabaeans, and the Chaldeans. Okay. Now, all of this is taking place in the area of Aram. Now, we have to sort of understand that what Job is describing here is post-Mitanni Aram. Now, before the end of the Late Bronze Age, Aram was essentially part of a big empire called the Mitanni. But at the end of the late Bronze Age, the Mitanni Empire was broken up. It was basically sort of sucked into the Hittite and the Syrian empires, and then it fell apart altogether. It become these little small city-states. So what we have here is a picture of, say, the life in Iran that more fits with an Iron Age setting. And I think that's actually the strongest evidence to suggest that Job is Iron Age. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. I hope that added some insight to this. Yes, the smelting is very indicative of Iron Age stuff, and we would definitely, not just the presence of iron alone, but the presence of iron smelting is Iron Age. And at the same time, too, we also have the cultural context of Job chapter 1 that does seem to indicate that this is in the Aramean period of the region. So anyway, thank you very much for the question, and I hope that helped. Alrighty. Now we're on to super chats. Okay, our first super chat here of the night is, let's pull down the Bible here. It's from Jack Ray for $5. Thank you very much for that super chat. So, and he says, oh. Who? Oh, okay. We're not at Bonbon. No, this is before. We're pre-Bonbon here. Okay. This is a pre-Bonbon Jack Ray super chat. I know. And he gives us a $5 donation. Thank you very much, Jack, for that donation and for this question. Okay. What are some of the names the Egyptians called themselves in the Old, Middle, Late, Upper, and Lower Kingdoms? Oh, that's a good question. Okay. Generally, Egyptians called themselves by their class. Okay. Now, if we want to talk about the people in general, now you'll sometimes hear, say, modern Kemetic people, and I use Kemetic here in the broadest sense, basically, be those who believe in, say, Kemetic religion, or basically Afrocentrists. They'll say that the people of Egypt call themselves the Kemet. They didn't call themselves the Kemet in ancient Egypt. Okay? That's a modern take on this, based upon nationalistic and identity politics. In the ancient times, what the Egyptians called themselves broadly was the Remech, the people. Now, there's an upper class, there's an upper crust of the Remech, and they were called the Pod people. Yes, I know what that sounds like. It's an invasion of the body snatchers. Okay, but they're the pot people. Okay, and that was your upper crust. That was your high craftsmen, your priests, your generals, all the nice, clean smelling people. Okay? So that's generally how they refer to themselves. They didn't call themselves Egyptians per se. It's actually quite even rare to find the word Kemet used in Egyptian documents. They had other affectations when they actually called Egypt itself. Now, when you get into, say, the Hellenistic period, where Egypt is, say, exposed to a lot of other countries and a lot of other empires, then they start taking on a more national identity. And they'll call themselves, Gyptos. Basically, people from Coptus, the city of Min, which is where we get the word Coptic from, and ultimately where we get the word Egypt from. Okay, it comes into the Greek. Coptus comes into the Greek as Gyptos, where we get Egyptos, Egypt. So, generally speaking, unless there's a tribal or ethnic distinction to be made, Egyptians will call themselves the Remech. Call themselves the Remech, or if they're in the upper crust, they'll call themselves the pot people. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. And I hope that answered your question. Yes, the pod people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's actually pot people. But they're from California. Whoa, dude. Totally awesome, man. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. All right, our next super chat here is from JP for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Thoughts on the Bible Project? Any praise or criticism? I have a little. I only have seen a few episodes of the Bible Project. Okay. I first of all, I understand what they're trying to achieve here. They're trying to cover all the Bible in sort of a very easy to ingest surface, so you don't have to get bogged down in details. So they're talking generalities here. Now, I would have one niggling criticism. Okay, niggling criticism, and I admit this is a niggling criticism. They sometimes use scholarship that's really out of date. Okay, like for example, on their episode of Exodus, they use Curid's idea that each of the plagues challenges one of the Egyptian gods. Yeah, that's not a good. Yeah, that's not good. It's based on a scholarship that's sort of now been kind of debunked. But so if I had one criticism is I think they needed to brush up a little bit on the scholarship, even though they are doing something that's very general and very broad here. So there's also not a lot of background information on what they do, but that's again not what they're trying to do. They're trying to give you a overall book by book summary. So I understand that, I get that, and I think in that respect that it's pretty decent. But again, it's just a book summary. So anyway, there's not a lot more I can say about this because again, I understand what they're trying to do, but I think they could have a little more. They could raise their scholarship up just a tad to things that are a little more current sometimes. But apart from that, I think what they do is fine. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Tom Lanchek for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. My kids study in Latin in school. Oh, they're so lucky. Can you explain any benefits of learning Latin? Oh yeah. Yeah, they won't be embarrassed if they go to England. I'll tell them that. Do you think it's useful in Bible study? It is, but not in a direct way. Any tips on studying it? Okay, that last question I can't help you with at all. I don't know Latin. That's the one language that I really, really wanted to learn, and I could never get that under my belt. Part of it was that it kept being offered at the school I was going to, but they never actually taught it. They never got an instructor to actually teach it. So we got a petition going. I mean, we had a lot of people who wanted to take Latin. And we just couldn't convince the administration to give it the green light, even though it's on the curriculum. So, do I think it's useful in Bible study? I'll tell you where the Latin is super useful. It's for understanding how English works. Latin, you have to learn all the grammatical constructions very, very well. So people who have learned Latin have an additional advantage when picking up other languages such as Hebrew and Greek. Let me put it to you this way. The biggest challenge that a Greek learner has is learning about English. And this seems like a very strange strange thing to say. But for example, our very first question of the night involved a grammatical question, which is, okay, the L prefix is the dative preposition. Well, English speakers don't think about their language in terms of grammatical construction. We just sort of speak it. So when we have to learn a second language, we have to learn those terms all over. So like we have to learn what the dative is, and the genitive, and the accusative, and the nominative. You know, all these parts of grammatical speech that are just taught to you in Latin. When you take Latin, you can't do Latin without knowing that stuff. Whereas somebody who's going from basically English first language, Greek second language, has to learn that. And it's going to be very, very difficult. In fact, one of the interesting things, like, for example, in Muntz's book on Greek, Introductory Greek, is his second chapter is about English grammar. It's not about Greek. It's that big of a problem. Our schools don't teach English grammar well. They're very poor at it, exceptionally poor at it. So when you have to learn another language, you're having to learn all these. You're not just learning the second language, you're learning the concepts that go into that language. And conversely, the concepts of your own language. So there's actually huge amounts of benefits to studying Latin. Plus, it opens your up to, say, 1,500 years of Western writing, which is also really a cool thing. So, yeah, I mean, if I had the opportunity, I would have taken Latin. It would have been very, very useful, especially in the sort of courses I ended up taking. And I think it's useful for children to learn Latin, because it's going to open up a world where they can learn other languages as well. So absolutely, I think this is a great thing. I think it's not directly useful in Bible study until they start learning those other languages. Once they learn those other languages, then the dividends are going to pay off. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. I'm jealous of your children, and I hope that helped. I hope they enjoy it too. I mean, look, if it's fun, if it's something that they can really sort of get their heads around, absolutely, this could be a really wonderful experience for them. So, Bon linguistics is boring. Well, speak for yourself. I like linguistics. Okay. Our next super chat here is from Tom Wanchek again for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Familiar with OT scholar Elmer Martin's thoughts? No. I all I know about him is he worked at a Mennonite college. That's about all I know about him. I haven't read much of his work, so I can't comment on it because I haven't actually explored his theology per se. I don't know what he believes. His name doesn't pop up in most of the literature I study. Because he's not a prominent figure in what I study, which is primarily the Exodus. I don't engage him a lot, but I do know that he was at a Mennonite college, and that's about all I know about him. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. And that's about all I can say about him. Algot Robinson for 100 Swedish kroners. Thank you very much for that super chat. Why did not God choose an empty land to be the promised land? That is actually a great question, and it actually has an answer, believe it or not. Let's see here. I can find this. Because God actually has told us why. Let me find it here. Okay. Now, this comes from Exodus 23, verse 29. I'm going to pop this up here because actually this gives us the answer. All right. Now, in this passage here, verse 28, and I will send hornets ahead of you that they may drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites before you. And then he says, I will not drive them out before you in a single year. Okay? Catch that. So, the Lord God is saying to the Israelites, I'm going to drive out all the nations ahead of you. Okay? But we're not going to do it all at once. Not going to happen all at once. It's going to take time. And then it goes on, that the land may not become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. And that's the reason why he didn't give the Israelites an empty land. We have to remember that in the Levant, there were still lions, bears, just nasty things. Lions, tigers, and bears, oh my. Lions, tigers, and bears, oh my.
So it's easier to drive out Canaanites.
Yeah, it's easier. Well, here's the thing. The Canaanites are occupying a place that would be otherwise inhabited by dangerous animals like lions and bears.
They're also cultivating.
Yeah. Brendan O'Brien. Lions, tigers, bears, Nephilim. Oh my. So yeah, that's if they've been given an empty land, they would have to basically till this thing from scratch. They'd have to drive out the animals and their numerous quantities. They'd also have to clear out the thorns and the thickets. You know, there's a lot of work that would be involved with basically a empty stretch of land. Because one of the things about nature is nature takes back the land once humans stop occupying it. Yeah, I mean, Danny DeMent said that's actually quite ecologically sound, and it is. Absolutely. It absolutely is. Well, we're seeing this in actually parts of North America now. Now that a lot of people are no longer farming, people are no longer occupying wide stretches of land in North America. And we're actually seeing a lot of wildlife return to that's not exactly friendly. Like cougars. You know, there's cougars, but there's also some other big cats roaming around North America that people have just let go. Like tigers. Like jaguars. Now, one of the things about, like the Black Panthers, they're actually native to Arizona, but they were hunted to extinction, but some people have brought them in from South America and have let them go, and now they're re-inhabiting the land because people are no longer living there. So this is why God did not choose to give them an empty piece of land, because they wouldn't have been able to occupy it. It would have been just too much. The challenges would have been too great, essentially. And again, we're told that here in Exodus 23:29. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate an interesting question. Okay. Next question here is also from Algot Robertson for 50 Swedish kroners. 5 Moses, and that's Deuteronomy 10:27. Does Moses convince God? Is this how our prayers work? Let me see about that. There's something about this that's kind of okay. Deuteronomy 10. There's a problem with this verse. I don't know what passage you're exactly referring to here, because Deuteronomy 10 does not have 27 verses. It's only got 22. So if you could update that question, because obviously I can't answer this without a proper Bible reference here. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to say I don't know exactly what's being referred to here because I can't find the passage. Because, again, it's Deuteronomy 10 does not have 27 verses. So you'll have to give me the proper verse. So if you can update that in the live chat, I can then answer the question, okay? So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Algot Robertson again for 10 Swedish kroner. Or sorry, 100 Swedish kroner. Thank you very much for the super chat. How did the Pharisee interpret the Bible wrong? What was the right interpretation at the time? Matthew 23:13. Do you have any favorite sitcom? All right. Let's deal with the passage here first, and then we'll deal with the sitcom. Matthew 23. Look here. Verse 13. Okay. And the passage reads, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from men, for you do not enter yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in." Okay. Basically, the interpretation is being sort of alluded to here. It's not discussed directly, okay? But what it's alluding to is the idea, and this was a very common idea in, say, late Second Temple period Judaism, that the way you got into heaven was by adherence to the law. Okay? Not by grace, not by faith, but by adherence to the law. Practicing the temple rituals, keeping every minutia of the law. The problem is, the law is a standard that is so high that nobody can attain it. So by doubling down and basically forcing people, by shaming them and whatever, to adhere to the smallest minutia of the law, like tithing their mint. You know, the mint is just growing wild outside their home, and they're expecting people to tithe that. I mean, look, if you let your mint grow in your field, you're going to have nothing but mint very soon. Because that stuff's a weed. Okay? So they're expecting you to tithe your weeds. So that's what's going on here, is they have misunderstood the overarching purpose of the law. And you see this in, say, the book of Galatians, where Paul goes into this in great detail, that the law is a schoolmaster to show you are not righteous, and that you need to put your trust in God to be saved. So that's the sort of the error of the Pharisees. That's what they get wrong here, is they are believing that only the law will save. And the law can only condemn. So that's why Christ here is saying, woe to them. Christ is not condemning the law. He is condemning that belief that the law will save you when the law can only condemn you. Relationship with God is what saves you. And that through Jesus Christ. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Albert Robinson, God bless you, Dr. Falk. Well, God bless you also. I'm glad there's some blessings here that are going around. Circular blessings are a good thing. Good thing. Okay. Tom Wanchek for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Why did God pick Egypt for Joseph in Matthew 2:13? Okay. Matthew 2:13. Now, to clarify here, this is Joseph, husband of Mary, not Joseph of the Old Testament. And verse 13. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. And he arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. Okay. Why Egypt? Well, there's actually several really, really good reasons why God chose Egypt for this. The first reason is there were established Jewish communities in Egypt. Okay. There were established Israelites. There were 5 Israelite communities in Egypt. Major ones. You have the one at Alexandria. You had the one at Pelusium. You had the one at Tel Yehudia. There's even one at Elephantine. So there's a lot of really, really good, well-established communities in Egypt that spoke the language, had the culture of it, had Israelite culture. They were Torah observant. So, Joseph could easily go, move to Egypt, be out of the reach of Herod. Outside of, say, Judea, Herod had no power, essentially. He was just a regional governor, or a king. They called them kings, but they were essentially regional governors. Under the Romans, of course. But there was no form of extradition. So it was once Joseph, Mary, and Christ were out of Judea and out of the reach of Herod's henchmen, they were sort of safe at that point. And Egypt had well-protected roads. It was not a place where one was in a lot of danger if you traveled. There was work when he gets to the other end. So, yeah, he'd have skills, marketable skills, because we have to understand also that in the first century, Egypt was in a bit of a growth phase. So they were still making public buildings. There'd be demand for Joseph's skills. There'd be a way to sustain the family. It was just an easy transition, really. And so that's why I think God chose Egypt for Joseph's family to escape to. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that helped, and I hope that explained it. Well, Bon, yeah, Egypt was pretty decadent in Roman times. It wasn't immoral, okay? Let's just say that it had a decadent side to it. But Egypt always had a decadent side. But at the same time, too, there were things that, we have to understand that ancient cultures in some ways seem to us to be decadent, but they also had their own standards of morality as well. Like, for example, let's for example take Rome. I mean, Rome has a horrible reputation for being decadent, okay, and being immoral, okay, and they had brothels, houses of prostitution, and they were generally legal, and the Roman government took a cut. They taxed these houses of prostitution, but at the same time, too, any person who used those houses of prostitution were disqualified from serving in the government. So there was this sort of double standard going on here, where Rome was basically had a vested interest in promoting prostitution, and at the same time, too, publicly decried it. So Egypt had its decadent side, but it also often decried it as well. So, it's ancient morality can be very, very tricky sometimes. Very tricky. Very nuanced. Okay? All right. So our next super chat here is from Tom Wanchek here for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he says, why did God bring up Job to Satan in Job 1? That's a very interesting question, and it's not a question we actually have a clear answer on. So let's bring it up. Okay, go to Job chapter 1. I'll just read the passage. And I'll start verse 1 here, and we'll probably skip through it. So, there was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, fearing God and turning from evil. I'll skip down here. Verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Now this is the divine council. And Satan also came among them. Now, Satan here is a job title. It's Hasatan, the accuser. And the Lord said to Satan, from where do you come? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, from roaming on the earth, walking about on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. Then verse 9. Verse 9 here, Satan sort of flips God's words on its head. Then Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Hast thou not made a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth thy hand now, and touch all that he has, he will surely curse thee to thy face. Okay. We don't know exactly why, and the text never explains why God allowed this to happen to Job, or basically set Job up here to be a target of Satan. We don't know why. God doesn't give us his reasons. And this is one of the things about Job, is some of this stuff happens in Job, and you're left wondering why. Job's left wondering why. Nobody knows the why, except that God is in control of this whole thing from beginning to end. And Job has some really horrible things happen to him. His children are killed. He has boils and sores. All his possessions are taken. God leaves him with his wife. I'm getting a dirty look now from my producer. It's an old joke, but it's part of it. It is part of the narrative. You can't deny that. She tells him to curse God and die. Yeah, I mean, great wife. So, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens to Job. And then when Job says, okay, I don't deserve any of this, and he's right, he doesn't deserve any of this. Job is absolutely dead right. He does not deserve all this misfortune to happen to him. And then God says to Job, okay, you want to question me? Let me question you first. Who put on glory and splendor? Who marked the way of the home of the light? Did you make the eagle proud? Did you set up the pillars of creation? God has all these questions that Job simply cannot answer. He does not know. And the implication here is Job is not wise enough to understand the misfortune, even if it was explained. Because there's bigger things going on here than just the life of Job. This has got cosmic consequences. So it's a really, really big drama that's happening on a very small ash pile with a few men. And I think that's why we have to be very, very circumspect about our own suffering. And I'll say this about the book of Job. The book of Job was not written to people in the state of suffering. And I want to make that really clear. It's not written to people in the state of suffering. It's written to people who are rich, who have wealth, who aren't suffering. You're supposed to read this book when times are good, to basically prepare you for if there is a bad time. Because it can always happen. Money comes, money goes. You can be rich today, poor tomorrow. So, it's to say, hey, rich man, consider, reflect, look at at your life, because it can all go in an instant.
What do people think about?
He wasn't a king. Okay, Job was not a king. He was just basically a wealthy sojourner, wealthy herder. So, I do think that this is a very, we're not given all the answers here. We're not supposed to have all the answers. And I think one of the answers that we're not given intentionally is why God chose to use Job here at this particular time. Other than there's a bigger drama going on here that we're given a slight little peek into. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that helped, and I very much appreciate the question. JP here for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do you think the Old Testament has a clear distinction between veneration and worship? No, it doesn't. It might be worship and veneration in the Old Testament there isn't a clear distinction. I mean, I've heard it said, some people say that, for example, the teraphim, which is kind of a ancestor idol, is just veneration. And that's a very, very difficult case to make. Really, the distinction between veneration and worship happens in, say, the church era. And it actually happens centuries into the church era. So that's where the distinction starts taking place, is well into the church era. So you don't find that distinction in the Old Testament prior. So I think that's a sort of an important thing to keep in mind, that when you do see worship used in the Old Testament, it's almost always sort of a kind of how do I say this? A kind of, as I say, worship of the being, not just say a veneration as a sign of respect. And that's really what we're talking about here, is the difference between veneration and worship. Worship is giving praise and glory to a thing, an item or a deity or whatever, whereas veneration is showing respect for it. Okay, without extolling it as having glory and worth and all that. Okay, as in being something that you pray to and that sort of thing. Now, pray to, I know there's sort of even a difference in, say, venerative prayer versus, say, worshipful prayer. So there's that distinction as well. But classically, in, say, Old Testament theology, prayer and all that is generally restricted to, say, worshipful prayer. So this is just not a distinction you find in the Old Testament. And it's sort of even doubtful if you find it in the New. But this is a distinction that really sort of shows up during, say, during the rise of, say, Akhenaten, icons in the 5th century, particularly icons. The icon controversy really sort of triggers this divide, this sort of theological distinctiveness. So that's when you're just going to start seeing this. This is in the 5th century AD. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that helped. Very much appreciated. Okay, Johnny Moe for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. What do you think is the best way to share the gospel with children? Ooh, great question. How can a child even begin to understand sin, heaven, hell? Thank you. All right. Well, very great. Those are excellent questions. And I do thank you very much for the super chat. I grew up in the Christian home. I came to Christ at age 7. At age 7, I already knew what sin was, what heaven was, what hell was. I had a basic understanding of all those things. Okay. Now, I might be a brighter than average 7-year-old, had been a brighter than average 7-year-old, but you know, I'm not that gifted. So, a child can definitely understand these concepts. It isn't something that's sort of beyond the means of a child. So, absolutely, they can understand this. They have the mental capability to do so. Now, the mental understanding of a 7-year-old is going to be very different than, say, a 4-year-old. You know, you can't expect a 4-year-old to understand the ideas of sin and hell and that sort of thing, because they don't have the cognitive framework. They don't have the cognitive development to understand that. But by 6 or 7, they can start to have that cognitive development where they can understand these things. So I don't think there's any problem with that. Now, we have to keep in mind, too, that, you know, in, say, medieval Europe, kids were treated a lot more adult than they are today. 10-year-old Queen Elizabeth understood 6 languages and read Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Italian, German, French. You know, she was a polyglot. And nobody thought that was unusual, that a 10-year-old could have that sort of mastery over that many languages. You know, no one thought any different of it. Okay. So, you know, it depends upon how they're being taught. So this gets back to your first question. What do you think is the best way to share the gospel with children? Okay. First of all, you give them an understanding of the Old Testament. And, you know, a lot of churches do this pretty well, where, you know, they teach Sunday school, you know. Now, I have a bone to pick with how some of this is taught, okay? But, you know, you teach them, you know, the stories in Genesis, King David, Joshua. You teach them about Prophet Daniel. All this development of the story, and you teach it as a story. You know, you don't teach it as fantasy. Okay. Now just where I would probably draw the line is that the way we should tell these stories should be in a true manner, a true and effective manner. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that when we use visual aids. You know, children are have great visual acuity. You know, they like pictures. Give them realistic pictures. The more realistic the pictures, the more they will see this as a true story when they get to be adults. Once they start understanding these stories, and they'll readily accept that. So, take your David C. Cook stuff with Jonah in the belly of the whale on a table with an oil lamp and sitting on a chair, and take those pictures, take them out and burn them. Okay? And replace it with a dead body inside of a fish. Okay? Yeah, children can handle that, believe it or not.
Much better.
I mean, considering that most children today are watching Game of Thrones without parental guidance, I think they can handle that. I mean, come on. No, now I am not advocating children watch Game of Thrones. Tanny the Mint, but the Veggie Tales. I mean, here's the thing: we both expose our kids to just the most graphic, horrifying stuff. Stuff that would have left our parents in nightmares 2 generations ago. And yet we wrap them in cotton batting on, the most, basic stuff. I mean, it's a strange, really, really strange inconsistency.
We watched them.
We watched Bane Ray, we watched The Red Wedding as soon as they turned 5. And all kids are watching this already. So show them realistic pictures of the Bible. Show him Jonah dead in the body of the whale. Show Noah's Ark. Show the big ark. Big ark with reasonably sized animals. Again, take your David C. Cook's pictures of the ark, take them out, set them on fire. You'll at least get heat out of that. It's the best thing you can do. Show them the big ark. A big, huge, properly proportioned ark, and maybe people drowning. Kids can handle that. So don't take the ark encounter. Well, with properly parental supervision, maybe. All right, so again, teaching the stories of the Old Testament. This is how you get them enculturated into the gospel. And what we're talking about here with evangelizing the children is the process of enculturation. It's not quite like parents, adults. Adult conversion is different. Adult conversion can be very, very different. Because adult conversion has, there's a background and there's an intellectual framework that adults have that you can say, give much less background to, and then just say, okay, here's the gospel. Children require more attention. You need to tell them stories to give them the background. And once they've got the background, they can just hear the gospel and then put all the pieces together. And once they put all the pieces together, they can decide for themselves, and they often will decide for themselves, to accept the gospel. Because they pretty much understand it. So the best way to share the gospel with children is to give them the building blocks. Give them the building blocks, one story at a time. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Johnny Moe again for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Along the lines of my other question, do you think there is an age of accountability? And if so, that vary from person to person? Or would that vary from person to person? The whole idea of an age of accountability is very controversial, okay? Now, there's no sort of set age in the Bible for an age of accountability. With that said, however, sometimes what's appealed to is the cutoff for Israelites who had been wandering in the wilderness, who had entered the wilderness as children and grew up, and basically, that previous generation had died. But now those who were of age 20 or less before the Exodus could enter the promised land. Okay? So there was that sort of idea that those who had been part of, say, the rebellion of Israel, they were not accountable for that. So, but after age 20, everyone should have known. So after that, that. Now, the problem is with that reading is that it's not actually tied to accountability. It's more tied to that they are now at least enculturated to, say, living as sojourners as opposed to city dwellers, like the first generation that left during the Exodus. So even though there's an attempt there by some to use that age at 20 as an age of accountability, I don't think that there's a lot of merit to that. But I think what we do have here is not an age of accountability, but God extending grace. Essentially. I don't think you need an age of accountability when God can just say, hey, I'm extending grace to those who don't understand, who can't understand because of their age. This is just a function of grace. And grace here we mean unmerited favor. God extends grace to those who, don't understand, who don't know, who haven't rejected him. So, this is again, like, for example, the question of, does somebody who has Down syndrome, can they be saved, even though they do not understand the intricacies of theology? And the answer is a categorical yes. Absolutely. And a lot of people with Down syndrome goes, I love Jesus. Okay, that's all you need. You're in. And here's the thing, though. Accountability is based upon what you're given. And it's not based upon age. So, like for example, the parables of the talents. For whom much is given, much is expected. If you have not been given much, if you're too young, not much is going to be expected. Grace is going to cover that. Absolutely going to cover that. If you've been given a Harvard education, okay, a lot more is going to be expected. You are in the place where you can know, and you are expected to find out. And because of that, there's going to be a lot more accountability. Accountability is an effect of what you've been given, not how old you are. So anyway, I hope that explains this. It's a great question. Thank you very much for the super chat, and very much appreciate it. Okay. Oh, I forgot to answer that last question. What's my favorite sitcom? I don't have a favorite sitcom. I don't watch sitcoms. Sorry.
Favorite sitcom was
Favorite sitcoms, Babylon 5. Okay. Next super chat here is from JP for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Thoughts on Eliakim typological arguments? Ooh, not a fan. I'll admit that, not a fan. Now, what's a Eliakim typological argument? It's basically a way to support, to make an apologetic for the Roman Catholic papacy, the authority of the Roman Catholic papacy, and the line of Peter. How does this work? Well, let's bring up our Bible here, and let's go to Matthew 16. Matthew 16. We're going to bounce between the two passages here, so I'll go from 17 to 19. All right. And, Christ here is saying, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter replies, you're the Christ. Okay? And verse 17, Jesus answers and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell, Hades, shall not overpower it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Okay. Now that's the first half of this argument, is that verse 19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound, and whatever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, they're going to interpret verse 19 according to Isaiah 22, Isaiah 22, 20 to 22. So we'll take a look at that passage next. Wrong one. Isaiah 22, verse 20 to 22. Now, and this happens as a prophecy of the line of David. Okay. Then it will come about in that day that I will summon my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your tunic and tie your sash securely about him, and I will trust him with your authority. And he will become the father of the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. Then I will set the key of the house of David on his shoulder, and when he opens, no one will shut. When he shuts, no one will open. Okay. Now, here's the argument. That this is the keys. This is the keys to heaven and earth that is given to the house of David. Okay? And that Peter is the continuation of the house of David. Okay, so there's going to be some exegetical problems here. First of all, the connection between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16 is dubious at best. Okay. The other thing is the house of David. The key here. Basically, there's a extra reading of how to say this. They read some extra stuff into these passages that I think are problematic. The idea that the key represents the chest of good works is how medieval and early modern Catholic theologians put this. So the key is supposed to go and open up good works to get people out of purgatory. Okay. This is the storehouse of Peter. Okay, this is the storehouse of Peter. So there's a certain reading that goes into this sort of interpretation. Now, the other issue is going to be that when we're going to bounce back to Matthew now, is Matthew 16, and we'll go right to 19 here. This whole, where Christ says, now, Christ has already said to Peter that, that the rock is Jesus Christ. And that's because there's a distinction here between Petros and Petra. They're not the same word. They are not the same word. And there's no Greek exegete that'll claim it's the same word. Yeah, you'll find it translated as the same in the Latin Vulgate. But we do our exegesis according to the Greek, not according to the Latin. So, when we look at verse 19 here, the context has already been that Jesus is the cornerstone. He is the cornerstone. He is the Petra. He is the firm foundation upon which the church is built. Not Peter. Okay? So then when we get to verse 19 here, and we look at that in the context of the passage, Christ says to Peter, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Okay. What are the keys to the kingdom of heaven? Jesus is the way. Okay. So whatever Peter preaches, that will open up the kingdom. And it's not exclusive to him. We have to understand that this is not exclusive to him. This is the gospel. Okay? So, when the gospel is not preached, there's no access to heaven. When the gospel is preached, there's no access to heaven. So, that's what's going on here. Darkblade asks, says, one Catholic on Quora argued that it was originally spoken in Aramaic, where both Peter and this rock could be Kepha. Yeah, I don't buy that. I don't think that's because the Greek here is really clear. It's really clear. So, you know, it might have been originally spoken in Aramaic, but the inspired writer wrote it as Petra. You have to understand that we don't deal with a hypothetical text that's, say, underneath this. We deal with the text that's given, that's received. And the received text is in Greek. So we have to do our exegesis according to Greek, not according to a hypothetical Aramaic reconstruction. So just to make that clear, okay? So this is just a matter of, again, sound exegesis. So with that said, the keys are not basically access to a heavenly storehouse of good works. The keys are the gospel itself. The preaching of the gospel, the authority of Jesus Christ, that's what opens up heaven. And in the same way, closes it. Yeah, my producer here said that this has really strong ethical implications for those that preach, say, the joke of the week. Okay, this has really strong implications for that. So there's a responsibility here. You know, just like any gatekeeper, you know, Jesus is basically telling the apostles here, you are the gatekeepers of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And there's a responsibility to this. So, with that said, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it, and I hope that helped. It was a great question. Yeah, it was a really good question. Okay. Angel WVM for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. Do we have any insight into the average age for marriage in ancient Near East cultures, specifically Israelites? It was a little all over the map, kind of like today. Now, typically young women were considered to be adults as soon as they started their monthly cycle. Okay? At that point, they were eligible for marriage. Now, generally, they waited a few years after that. So, typically, women were married off around between 15 to 19 years old. Again, this is a culture. This is a survival culture. People are living here on knife-edge agriculture. Death was frequent. Because of that, people needed to start bearing children young, when they were at the height of their fertility. So, now, on the other hand, men could be, like today, all over the map as far as what age they would enter into marriage. Now, you did have marriages back then, and most marriages back then were arranged. They weren't usually agreed by the parties involved, unless it was like a second marriage or a widow situation. First marriages were typically almost always arranged. And basically, parents back then would get together with another set of parents and basically say, hey, we got a good match here. Let's do this thing. Or they would approach someone who's really wealthy. Hey, we got an eligible daughter. You're well off. You know, we think this is a good match. And that's typically how marriages back in the ancient Near East were basically arranged. So it was based upon wealth and securing basically the future of your children. So because of that, women tended to marry very young. Men typically, they were not so often married when they were young, not unless the dad was rich. If the dad was rich and the son was inheriting, oh yeah, then the son would marry young. Otherwise, men would often not marry until later in life. And that's just the way it just worked back then. Yeah, so there were times when a man would have to also serve as say in the military. So between ages 20 to 25, especially at times of war, men would often have to serve in, say, military and would not be eligible for marriage at that time. So there's a whole lot going on there. Now we have to understand, like for example, in the marriage of Ruth, very different. There's very special circumstances there. For her, it was a second marriage. She had already had 2 kids that had died. Boaz was an old man. I mean, he's in his 50s. She's probably in her 30s. Okay. She's in her 30s. I mean, again, here's another time when we take our David C. Cook Sunday school materials, take it out to the bonfire and chuck them in. You know, because every Sunday school packet I've ever seen on the teaching of Ruth shows Ruth as this young, naive 17-year-old. No, she had been married once and had been married for decades. And then her husband died and her 2 children died, and you know, she was now a widower with no support, or widow with no support. Yeah, with mother-in-law. Naomi's the mother. So that, yeah, this is just, I mean, she's in her 30s. You know, this is why we see, for example, in the book of Ruth, that marriage proposal is much more of a business deal than it is a smitten with love. Okay? I mean, it's really a business deal. You know, I think this is a good match. You think this is a good match? We like each other relatively okay. We think this would be good. Yeah. Yeah, she's still in childbearing years at age of 30. You know, he's ready to settle down. You know, he's alone, and you know, and he's drinking too much because he's alone, and yeah, okay. That's all, that makes sense. So that tells you sort of the range of marriage in ancient Israel as well. Which is, it could be anything from some two sets of parents arranging a good match for their kids, to a younger man with an older man with a younger woman, or even 2 older people who decide on their own to get married. So we don't actually have an average age of marriage in ancient Israel, but it wouldn't be unreasonable to say around 19-ish. That's probably the average age for a woman. For a man, it's probably 30s to 40s. So, anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Josh Nichols for $9.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he says, "Good evening, Dr. Falk." Oh, good evening, Josh. What are some good resources, commentaries, articles on Job? Thank you. Oh boy, I wish you had asked me this about 30 years ago. I did an entire grad school course on the Book of Job. And back then, I could have listed you all the sources. Today, I can't. I don't even remember what I read on Job. But I read a lot on Job. So I can't name you anything right now because it's been that long. As I said, I did this course in the 1990s. So that sort of tells you how long it's been. Early 1990s, by the way. So if I picked up those books, I might be able to figure it out, but I haven't looked at say materials for Job in just, as I said, ages, 30 years. It's been that long. So unfortunately, I can't help you here. But what I would suggest is if you want to start with a commentary, probably if the Nikot, this is New International Commentary of the Old Testament, has a commentary, it's probably going to be a pretty good one. Their Old Testament commentaries are excellent. So that's probably a good place to start. There's been a lot of work done on Job. A lot of people have written on Job, so it's well worth looking at a variety of resources here. Some are good, some are bad, but by the time you've read like 10 commentaries, you've got a pretty good idea that this is going to pan out, this one isn't. So, again, I can't name you any specific because it's been too long, but anyway. That's the best I can do for you here. Again, I'd start with the Nikot commentary on Job, and maybe Hermeneia, maybe the Hermeneia commentary. Hermeneia commentaries tend to be more on the liberal bent, but they're also very good. So anyway, this is again, the Hermeneia series is liberal scholarship that I think is quite well done. So I don't have any problems recommending them. But if you want more, say, of a devotional kind of resource, they're not the place to go for that. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. And I'm sorry, that's the best I can do. Okay. Got a comment here from Jack Ray. Could you check your email for a donation? All right, will do. Here. The squirrels are basically spinning up my email here. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Jack Ray gives us a $50 super chat. Thank you very much for the donation. We really, really appreciate it. He, of course, used our PayPal link, which is in the description. Thank you very much for the donation. We very, very much appreciate it. And we appreciate everything you've done to help us on this channel. It's really kept us going. And we're now fortunately starting to look at the possibility of with me leaving my day job to start writing books again, and that would be wonderful. And we can only do it because of the generous support of our super chatters. So thank you so very much for the help. We really appreciate the donations, and this is where it's all going to lead. It's going to lead to more research being done on the Bible and on ancient Egypt. So thank you so very much. We really appreciate it. Okay. I see right one. Addison isn't here, so we might not be going late. That might not be so bad for me since I have to get up at like 6 a.m. tomorrow to go to work, so I might actually get a night's sleep. Who knows? All right, I see a $5 super chat here from Jack Ray. Sponsor bonbon question. Okay. Yeah, so that's the one where above or below this. Okay.
And Deuteronomy. But what if the
Okay. Okay. Here's the question. And Deuteronomy 21:18-21. One is said that a son who is rebellious drunkard is to be stoned. That's not his worst crime. But what if the parents support their son and are just as bad and enable his behavior? Is there punishment for them? Okay. Like if the parents were indifferent to that, even though it's basically murder by proxy and the parents don't care, is there punishment for them in what's happening? What are people supposed to do? Okay. Let's bring up the passage here, which is Deuteronomy, because there's a twist here. 21, 18 to 20. We'll start at verse 18. If any man has a stubborn and rebellious son, who will not obey his father or his mother when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them. And then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his hometown. And they shall say to the elders of the city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death, and you shall remove the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear of it and fear. Okay. Now, what's going on here is this is an empty man, what they would call in the Old Testament an empty vessel, okay? A worthless man. Now, nobody is thinking at this point that when they stone this guy, that the parents are perfect, not by any stretch of the imagination. And let's say that they were bad and did enable this. They're also the ones turning him in. Okay? The father and the mother have seized the son. So, in that respect, there's a sort of an accountability that's going on here. So there's not an unlimited support here being offered by the parents. And we got to keep that in mind here, because in verse 19 it says, "Then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the others at the gateway of his home." Now, his crime here is not just being rebellious and a drunkard, okay? That's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. The real crime here is in verse 20. This son of ours, the text says, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. That glutton thing that's bad, okay? We are dealing here with a culture that lives on knife-edge agriculture. Everyone gets a share of the food that's produced. If you eat more than your share, somebody is going to die. The whole community is going to know this because people watch the grain. So the whole town realizes that this guy's killing people. They all know. Mom and dad know. The mayor knows. Everybody in this town knows that this guy is eating too much. He's a drunkard. He's rebellious. He won't stop the behavior. And because of that, people are continuing to die. So that behavior has to be put to an end, because lives are on the line. So this is why this entire law is put into place. And frankly, the fact is the onus is put upon the parents to rectify it. And if they can't get them to stop killing people by eating too much, and yes, that's a thing, they have to make sure that atonement is made. And, it's a bad situation. But this is a bad situation. Now, we have to understand, too, this is talking about an adult son. This is not talking about a toddler. no one's taking a 3-year-old up to the elders of the city and say, this rebellious son of mine is a drunkard and a glutton. Okay? It's not talking about 3-year-olds. These are adult sons. Okay? This is an adult. So,
Mothers are-
are they just shepherds at this time? Doesn't specify, but they could be. They could be also. This could be within a city too. So,
in
yeah, in Egypt they were on knife edge agriculture. So, yeah, they're at this point they're wandering around the Sinai. So that's when this command is given, is while they're still sojourning in the Sinai. But it's also talking about city life. Verse 20, and they shall say to the elders of his city. Okay. So this is a prospective command. So this is not just saying, okay, that this is a part of shepherd life, but this is ongoing into what's going to take place in the promised land. Okay. So there doesn't seem to be any command that would place. There doesn't seem to be any punishment here for bad parenting, other than public shame. Now we have to understand here that public shame is going to play a huge role in this.
I'm not saying what's happening. It's the if nobody brought the father.
If no one, I mean, if no one brings the father out, there's no punishment, essentially. But then again, too, what you're going to get here is public pressure. And public pressure here is going to be intense. Okay? Because again, people are dying. I mean, if it's the whole family that's gluttonous, and killing people, that's going to have ramifications. And there's a lot of ramifications for gluttony. And, there's that public pressure is going to be intense. They're going to be the most hated family in town. And if you've ever lived in a small town and you're the most hated person in town, life's not going to be easy for you. No one's going to do business with you. People are going to spit on you in public. There are going to be huge consequences to a whole family that behaves this way. Yeah, Darkblade says, eventually a mob will kick down the door and seize the glutton family. That's exactly what will happen. That's exactly what will happen. Is you'll get a mob. Yeah, and Darkblade, eventually a mob will kick down the door and seize the glutton family. Exactly, that's exactly what will happen. So, yeah, they won't put up with it. But it's a little different when it's one individual within that family. So absolutely, it's just, in some ways this is a self-correcting problem when the entire family's involved. Because again, the rest of the townsfolk are not going to put up with it. But when it's one individual who's carousing, then the burden of responsibility would, say, shift away from, say, the mob and onto the parents to take care of this. In many respects, it's the parents' responsibility because they're the one who raised the little monster. So they raise the monster, they have to deal with the monster. It's kind of like and there's a lot of this sort of hands-on justice in this culture. Like, for example, if a family member was killed by a murderer, the person who exacts the judgment is the next of kin. It's not the judge who enacts the murder verdict. It's the next of kin. So that's the way it works. So that the next of kin is largely responsible for enacting justice, rectifying situations like this. So that's why the mother and father have to deal with this, is because of that responsibility to the community as a whole. So anyway, that pretty much explains why the parents would be responsible. It also explains, too, frankly, why there wouldn't be any penalty on the parents. because if the parents were acting in this exact same way, even if they enable it, there's the community itself would take care of this. So anyway, thank you very much for the question, and I want to thank Jack Ray for sponsoring this question. Okay. Next question. Is here from 1000 Cleverboy for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Please answer Dilgamesh's question just above. Okay. Right here. There it is. All right. Dilgamesh says, could the word aluka, leech, in Proverbs 30:15 be referring to a vampire? The word alak occurs in Arabic literature as the name of a vampire, maybe so, maybe similar cognate. Well, interesting question. It's a very interesting question. Let's take a look at that passage here and see what it says. Proverbs 30:15. Okay. We'll start verse 14. There is a kind of man whose teeth are like swords, his jaw teeth like knives, to devour the afflicted from the earth and the needy from among men. The leech has 2 daughters. Give, there are 3 things that will not be satisfied, 4 that will not say enough. Sheol and the barren woman, earth that is never satisfied with water, and fire that never says enough. Okay. This is sort of a person who predates on the needy. Okay. Now, this is not a vampire, not in the mythological sense of a walking cadaver that sucks blood. Unfortunately, although that would be super cool if it was. But no, this is being a leech in the more conventional sense of basically somebody who is draining the life of another person. The needy in this particular case. So, basically predating on the misfortunate, the unfortunate. So it's the other kind of worst, the worst kind of vampire, the one that predates upon the poor and the underprivileged. So, and there is a respect where that's there has been that sort of connotation at some point between, say, the mythological vampire and say that sort of leech-like capacity. Now we have to understand too that back in the time too that Israel did have leeches. Okay, they don't have them today. Okay, but in the coastal back before the Israelis drained the coastal plain in the 1940s, there was actually a swamp in Israel that separated the coastal plain from the Judean foothills. And in that swamp was some very interesting life. They had hippos. Yes, Israel had hippos once upon a time. They also had leeches. And it was a swamp. It was a full swamp. So apparently very, very difficult to pass. So there was that back then. So, this is an animal that, an animal, kind of nematode, or whatever leech is technically. I don't know what kind of animal it is technically. It's a worm-like thing. But it was a real animal, and that's what they're comparing it to here. So that's what they're comparing this kind of person to. So I don't think this is talking about a vampire. Okay. Now, it makes sense that later on in, say, Arabic literature, it would use the word for leech to mean vampire. That makes total sense. But you can't go back and say the original context in Proverbs 30:15 means vampire, because that would be the etymological fallacy. It's basically comparing a later meaning and saying that that's what the earlier word means. So even though this would be so cool if it was true, it probably isn't. So anyway, thank you very much for that super chat, and thank you 1000 Clever Boy for sponsoring that super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Cool question, though. Very cool question. Okay. Okay, Jack Ray for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Sponsor the bonbon question directly above this. Okay. That question was already sponsored. Oh wait, maybe I missed that. Okay, we'll take one below then. Let's see here. Let's pick another bonbon question here. Okay. See if I can find a bonbon question. Yeah, it's tons. All right, we'll take this one here. Does the story of the eloquent peasant indicate bouts of materialistic related thinking? For example, money doesn't matter type thing in Egypt. What does this show about Egyptian culture of the time? Okay, now, the eloquent peasant is a story that was probably written around the Middle Kingdom, but might date to much earlier, maybe as early as the Old Kingdom. Now, what we have to understand about this eloquent peasant too is that there was no money. Okay, so back then, we're still dealing with a borrower economy in Egypt. There's no money, but people did try to accumulate possessions. In the case of the elegant peasant, what we're dealing with here is a wise peasant. Very wise peasant. You know, one who is very skilled, very wise and very skilled in the arts of magic and all that. Now, the guy would drink like 6 gallons of beer a day. Okay, so I mean, hey, if you're drinking 6 gallons of beer a day, you don't need much of anything at that point. I mean, if I drank 6 gallons of beer today, I wouldn't care much about my materialist lifestyle either. I mean, I don't think I'd care about much of anything at that point. Danny demand a liver transplant, maybe. Maybe. Okay. So, but there is sort of this idea that, this guy didn't much care if he earned lots or not. He was not trying to build up a household. He was happy. He was content. And he was content not just in his... he was content in what he knew, his wisdom. He'd seen lots of life itself. So there's always been a sense in Egyptian culture that the accumulation of wealth is it was something that was broadly practiced. It doesn't actually mean much. It's not much so much about a commentary of materialistic thinking. And I think to sort of read that into the eloquent peasant sort of misses the point of the story. That's sort of taking a modern reading and reading it into that. The Eloquent Peasant is more about this sort of oddball who's a bit outside of the society, who is incredibly wise, incredibly skilled, gifted at scribal arts and magic, and can help the king, essentially. So, it's more of a tale of, don't necessarily, judge a guy that's sort of, you know, who's gone his own way. So it's more along that lines, but it's really more of a tale of somebody who's, as I said, who has the confidence in himself to be who he was in a society where status mattered. It's maybe more of a commentary against status than it really is against materialism. Because your typical Egyptian reader wouldn't have read that and said, "Oh, well, I should stop accumulating stuff." No, it's more that the constant climbing up the social ladder doesn't necessarily get you happiness. So that's probably the best we can do with that. Again, there's a lot more going on here than just that. But on the very sort of surface level, it's again about a guy who's deeply skilled. He's got lots of street cred. He's a talented scribe and magician, etc., and he's got a ton of street cred. So again, it's again, don't overlook someone just because they're not climbing the social ladder. Is essentially what this boils down to. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. I want to thank Jack Ray for sponsoring this question. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay. JP for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. How similar is Coptic compared to ancient Egyptian? Very similar. It's ancient Egyptian. Coptic is basically the last phase of the Egyptian language. Coptic is about 90% late Egyptian, 10% Greek. Okay, and it uses late Egyptian grammatical constructions for the most part. It's got a few extra grammatical constructions, so it's an expansion upon late Egyptian. But it also has its own sort of syntax, spellings, that sort of thing. It uses a different writing system. So it uses the Greek alphabet plus 6 extra letters to cover the extra phonemes. But it is under the cover. Under the cover, it is Egyptian. There is no doubt about it. Now, here's one of the things I think that more should happen with teaching a Coptic. One of the things I see about Coptic that I don't like is how it's taught. I think a lot of times it should be taught as, say, the final course in Egyptian. It's often not. Sometimes it's not even taught by instructors that know Egyptian. You'll find Greek instructors try to teach Coptic, and it can be a bit of a disaster because they just don't get the construction underneath it. I know that the typical curriculum in most Egyptology programs teaches often Middle Egyptian, 2 years of Middle Egyptian, then Coptic, then late Egyptian. And I think those last two should be reversed. Because, once you know late Egyptian, Coptic's pretty easy. So, again, I would very much sort of, this is a language that should be taught by Egyptologists. If they know Greek as well, that's also a bonus. But it's very much, I think, one of those things where if you had better instruction, a lot more people would probably pick up this language. But again, I think it's one of those sort of cumulatively languages that the more you know about Egyptian going into it, the easier it is to learn it. So anyway, it's essentially Egyptian. It's essentially Egyptian. Can Dr. Falk speak Egyptian? Dr. Falk can barely speak English. I can read Egyptian. I can read like 13, 15 languages, but I can't speak any of them very well. It's just, here's the thing. Speaking a language is a different skill than reading a language. It's a lot different skill. And you can learn to read lots of languages very easily. Speaking them, it takes a different talent. It takes, you're training your ear, you're training your, you're opening new mental pathways to learn to speak. So speaking is a challenge. Just like learning to understand and comprehend is a challenge. But reading it is a different sort of challenge, and it's a lot easier to do, honestly. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, Eddie P for $9.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. In classical theology, God is dispassionate, yet in the Bible he seems to be emotional. Anger, wrath, radical love. Hosea, how do you know when God is being anthropomorphized, and are there textual clues? Okay. Yeah, this is a divide. This is definitely a divide between classical theology and, say, more biblical theology. One of the things that, say, classical theology does is it does see God as a being without emotion, because of the simplicity of God. God is stateless, so he doesn't change. The idea here is, in classical theology, to have emotion, you have to go from state 1 to state 2. So go from, say, not being angry to being angry. But there's also a problem with that point of view as well, which is that, say, the emotion of God isn't a change of state. It's a position. And I think that's the difference here between, say, more classical and biblical theology as far as the passions of God. Like, take for example God's anger. God is always angry against sin. Always angry. But that's a positional thing. God doesn't cease to be angry at sin. God is, because of the position sin is in and position God is in, God's reaction will always be anger. It never changes. Just like God seeing the Imago Dei inside of us invokes in God the positional passion of love. So that's an important distinction we have to make here, as when we look at, say, the emotions of God. It's not a reflection of a change of state, because God doesn't change. It's that the position of God never changes in regard to certain things. So I don't think, even when God relents, it's a move of position, not a remove. It's not a change in God himself. So, for example, like when the people at the base of Mount Sinai, they sin. The Ten Commandments aren't even, the dust isn't even off the stones, and they're already sitting down below, and they've already broken the covenant. So what happens is, God says to Moses, "Hey, I'm gonna smite these people because they've already broken the covenant." And Moses goes, "No, don't do that. What will other people think of you? And have mercy and grace upon them." And God says, "Okay, all right, I'll defer it. I'll relent." And the relent here is not repent, but it's a deferral. And then Moses goes down and he has a complete anger orgy. He just goes nuts and starts killing a whole bunch of people down there because he sees how bad it is. And then finally, God extracts a token judgment at the end of that. So, God was positionally angry. He hadn't ceased to be angry, but he had deferred it. He changed, he moved the position to where he can say, okay, I'm not going to deal with this right now. I'm going to deal with it later. Still angry about the sin. That didn't change. Even when he relented, he did not change his position on his attitudes towards sin. He just waited until a later time. God's very patient. Yeah, God's very patient. He is slow to anger. And we see that, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, slow to anger and full of grace. So anyway, again, that's how we kind of have to look at this, is the whole issue of God's emotion is through the lens of his position, not any sort of changed state. So that doesn't, again, I wouldn't rely on classical theology for this. But again, anthropomorphizing, again, I'm not a huge fan of that. There's some places where God is definitely anthropomorphized. I don't think it's in the emotional states. Because without those emotional states, we don't have the Christian God. We don't have a God that's all good. So, those emotional states, again, based on position, not change. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that helped explain this. Very, very much appreciate it. Nick Felstead for 20 Australian. Thank you very much for the super chat. Thank you for all you do. Well, you're most welcome. We do very, very much enjoy these Friday nights. It's our way of giving back to the community. And, it's just, this is our passion to educate and to teach people and to get them loving the Bible and to them to dig into it themselves. So absolutely, we love doing this. This is our service to the community. Love to see how well your channel is doing. Almost 10,000 subs. Yeah, we're getting very close to 10,000 subs. We're at like 9,600 today. So we're very, very close to 10K. We're actually really looking forward to that because we should have some sound foxes. Have some sound fox swag ready for that. We all need sound foxes. Well, it has very much surprised us how well the people have been responding to the channel. I have related this story a number of times already that when we started this channel, we were thinking, okay, this is such a niche channel. We'll get 100 subscribers. And we did know that we were not the typical formula. Even very early on, there were people who were complaining about certain low content things about the channel. And it's like, okay, well, we're just going to do what we do. We even had one guy prophesy saying that we would never, never hit 1,000 subscribers. So, that came and went a long time ago. But we do actually get a lot of pressure from people asking us to change because, it'll affect our growth. And it's like, okay, now, you know what? We have never been concerned about growth, honestly. It's just, okay, if it grows, it grows. This is one of the things is we want to teach. And we'll teach in the style that we feel comfortable with, and then leave the increase to God. If God blesses it, he blesses it. If he doesn't bless it, he doesn't bless it. Either way, praise the Lord. That's just the way we operate here. is we think that, just be faithful to do the work well. And if you do the work well, okay, then God will see to the increase. So, so we've never chased subscribers. We are grateful when we get subscribers. We are grateful to all our subscribers. We think that we are trying to build a community here. So if people do subscribe, we really enjoy that. And yes, when we get a healthy hit of subscribers, we think this is cool. Because who doesn't like this to know that your work is appreciated? So, but we're not focused on it. I wear a t-shirt, by the way. Got these new t-shirts. We got these new Velociraptor t-shirts. In here, and this is the Apex Predator cover. So new t-shirts. So yeah, I don't wear a suit. I don't wear collared shirt and tie. I wear t-shirts on these things. We're not really that interested in creating a false image. So we basically are ourselves on this channel. It's just like, okay, yeah, and some people will like it, some people won't. We're okay with that. We're just totally cool with that. So and we realize some people this will not appeal to some people. Well, okay. There's lots of channels on YouTube, and I do think that there's channels out there for everybody's tastes, and I'm okay with that. We actually have a channel that is of a very different and kind of an offbeat kind of taste. Okay, so I'm grateful that you like the channel. Thank you very much for your support of the channel. We really appreciate it. Thank you for that super chat, and we hope to have something to celebrate that 10K very soon. It looks like by the statistics, it'll probably be still a couple months before we hit that 2K, or sorry, 10K. But we're looking forward to it. We have it's sort of kind of the we are aware that already. What was it? It's like 1.4% of YouTube channels ever make it to 10K. It's a very small number. So that's an important milestone in any channel growth. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated, and I'm glad you're enjoying the channel, and we love serving the community. Okay. Okay, JB for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Can you describe the development of Egyptian warfare from early to late kingdom, weapons, tactics, and military goals? Yes, okay. I can give you an overview of this. If you want more information on this, I would recommend reading Ballinger's book on Egyptian warfare. It's very good. It's a very good book on Egyptian warfare. However, okay. In the earliest periods, they were basically killing each other with stone maces, essentially. They had the bow already. They didn't have the composite bow, but they had, say, the simple bow. The arrows were made of reeds and, say, stone tips. You did have some slashing weapons that were basically essentially a piece of wood with flint blades etched in it. So these things were razor sharp. They're razor sharp. You didn't have at that point swords because there wasn't a lot of bronze in say Old Kingdom Egypt. So they're basically killing each other with maces, basically stone maces. So you have a pole with a mace head on the top. So that sort of describes, say, Old Kingdom warfare. Now, Middle Kingdom, you start getting new advances. You start getting bronze weapons introduced. Not much armor, but armor's very expensive. Most soldiers didn't have armor back then. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, so, yep. Rocks, club, bow, arrow, catapult, missiles, nukes. Yep, that's pretty much it. That's the progression. Yeah, so you get to the Middle Kingdom, you start seeing changes in say the weapons being used. The bow starts being the bow is still used, but they're now using bronze arrowheads. You also see the advent of siege towers. They're using javelins and spears. The mace head becomes an almost obsolete technology at this point. So Middle Kingdom, they're pretty much no longer using the mace. They're pretty much going all the way in on the spears thing. So at that point, maces. I mean, even though you still see maces used in iconography, it becomes more of a symbolic weapon than it is actually a practical weapon of warfare. In the second intermediate period, you get the development of the chariot and the composite bow. So at that point, you start seeing chariot warfare introduced into Egypt. And the chariot sort of coincides with the introduction of the composite bow. They're related technologies. In fact, the chariot, the wheel, is an extension of composite bow making technology, where wood is laminated and then stretched. In the case of a bow, it's stretched to make a bow. In the case of a wheel, that wood is stretched around an axle with spokes. Okay. Now, this is going to at this point, bronze weaponry is going to dominate. They're gonna use swords. They're gonna use like Kopesh swords, and that's going to continue on into the late period. Now, once they get into the late period, there's still going to be primarily a bronze wielding army, but there's going to introduce some iron tools as well at that point. So you're going to see changes in the design of swords and some weaponry. You're also, once you get into, say, the late period, you're also going to see sort of the introduction of certain animals used in warfare, particularly elephants. They're going to start using some elephants in warfare as more or less mobile archery platforms. Now, the chariot is a high-speed mobile archery platform, but what it doesn't offer is stability or height. So the elephant was used in, say, the late period and all the way into actually the Ptolemaic period with the to get more height and more stability to the archers, so they can get further range, a much longer range of fire. They also get they can get more accuracy too. Although still, an elephant shooting from the top of an elephant is not exactly the most stable thing to do, because it is rocking back and forth. But it's more stable than a chariot that's just whipping around. So, and by the late period, you're talking about a primarily, still primarily a bronze wielding army, but by the Hellenistic period, it's all going to change. During the Ptolemaic period, the armies are going to use primarily at this point steel and iron weaponry. It's like swords. A lot of it will be designed from the Greek swords, etc. So you're going to get a lot of Greek-style armaments being used, and at that point, it's pretty much as modern as the Egyptian army gets until the Romans appear. So that's an overview of Egyptian warfare tactics and weapons from the Old Kingdom and pre-dynastic period, all the way to, say, the end of the Ptolemaic period. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that helped. Very, very much appreciated. Brick Creation says, didn't the Seleucids use elephants in war? Yeah, both sides did. But there was a difference in the elephant too. The Seleucids used the Indian elephant. The Egyptians used the African elephant. Much more difficult to control an African elephant. And they're bigger too. Oh yeah. It was a very horrible thing to do to the elephants. Elephants don't want to go to war. Unless it's a male elephant. They're mean. Male elephants are really mean. Especially African ones. Oh, they're dangerous. Remember our friend John, who got chased in a jeep by an African elephant, a male one?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're mean. Even zoos have difficulty controlling male African elephants. They're just very difficult to control. Okay, Linguist Ammo for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Evening, just a comment. I thought the workers' strike in the Late New Kingdom was fascinating. New video coming out next week. Awesome. Well, it is fascinating. There's a whole lot of interesting stuff about the workers' strike. And that even has implications for the Exodus, too. Because there is a huge number of similarities between the Exodus narrative and the workers' strike. The difference, though, is that the strike at Deir el-Medina takes place much, much after the Exodus. So there does seem to have been this sort of tradition of, say, worker protest movements, at least in the New Kingdom. So anyway, yeah, it's a very, very interesting. And it's actually, to be honest, Egyptologists study this really closely because there's a lot of information in there. Because it's, again, one of the most fascinating periods in Egyptian history. And it is just a whole lot of stuff we've learned as a result of those texts at Deir el-Medina that have given us insight into this as well. So, yeah, very interesting. Very, very interesting. I agree with you. It's exceptionally interesting. So, thank you much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And by the way, I loved your video with IP on Amenhotep II not being the pharaoh of the Exodus, and I couldn't agree more. So have a great night. Thank you very much for the super chat, and very much appreciated. Okay, I don't see a message from him, but we just got a very, very generous super chat from Slade Neighbors for $300. Thank you very much. Very, very much appreciated. That's very generous of you. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you so very much. This is really going to help us to eventually go independent, and we are so grateful for this because it's going to, as I said before, we are working towards making this moving into full-time ministry here. So, right now we do this part-time. I have a day job that sort of splits my time be with the channel here, and we understand that if we for free of that day job, that we'll be able to write books and create more complicated content too. So we are very, very much looking forward to doing that, and that's our goals for the channel. So we really appreciate your very, very generous support. Thank you so very, very much. We really appreciate it. Okay, the next super chat here is from Juan for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Why is there no documented evidence of Yahweh before the Bronze Age collapse? For example, Stone Age, Copper Age, or other religious beliefs. My biggest issue. Okay. Some of this is okay. First of all, the Bronze Age collapse is pretty much coincides with when Israel enters into the Promised Land. So that's going to be roughly, the end of the late Bronze Age, beginning of the early Iron Age. You're talking around, say, about 1200 BC, roughly. Okay, so the other thing we're going to talk about here is preservation. Now, in the case of, say, Yahweh's particularly a difficult deity to track down in documents. And part of the reason why he's so difficult to track down is because Yahweh can not just mean the name of a deity, it can also be the verb to be. Particularly, he is. So if we have fragments of text, now in some ways, in some places, we have like seal inscriptions and we can look up and see the names of gods on them because those gods are very identifiable. Like, for example, we pick up a Edomite seal inscription and it happens to have the name Kus on it, and we know that's in the name of an Edomite deity. Likewise, we pick up an Ammonite seal inscription and it happens to have the name Milcom on it, very recognizable as a deity, even in a fragment. But let's say we pick up a seal from, say, Canaan, and it happened to have the Tetragrammaton on it. Well, that may be the name of a deity. That also may be the name of, or just the verb to be, he is. So because we can't always be exactly sure about that, it can be a bit problematic. So now, before the Bronze Age collapse, we do actually have a lot of evidence of, say, religious beliefs. What we lack is text evidence, and that's sort of the issue here. Is what we lack is texts. We do have evidence of certain practices that is pre-Bronze Age collapse, like standing stones, the matzebot. The Bible talks about how, say, Abraham set up matzebot at Shechem. We do find matzebot at Shechem. So that's verified. Now, whether or not those matzebot were set up by Abraham is unclear. But the fact there are matzebot at Shechem is very, very suggestive. We also find at some ritual sites, say, pre-Bronze Age collapse, the offering of certain animals that were not kosher. So there was offerings being made to deities at, prior to the Exodus. We also find, we do have some text from Ugarit that suggests the religious beliefs of, say, the people at that city of Ugarit. So, there are some things here that are highly suggestive. We do have some textual issues, a lack of evidence. I mean, that's not a game changer a disqualifier. But we are getting more and more evidence as time goes on. And as that evidence becomes apparent, we will learn from it and make adjustments accordingly. So it's just like, okay, let's see where the evidence leads. And right now, there is some evidence of religion before a Bronze Age collapse, although not of Israelite religion. Because, frankly, there were no Israelites prior to the Bronze Age collapse. So that's going to be an issue. Okay? Yeah, there's going to be, you find Israelites. We have to be very careful. One of the things we have to be very careful of, like, for example, I've heard, say, some skeptics say this, that, they discount the idea of an Exodus because they don't find Israelites in Egypt worshiping Yahweh. Well, of course not. Okay? We wouldn't expect that. We wouldn't expect to find that. And the reason we wouldn't expect to find that is, first of all, Yahweh worship was brought into the Israelites by Moses. He's traveling out in Midian. He picks up Yahweh worship out there, and he brings that back. So we wouldn't expect Israelites in Egypt to be worshiping Yahweh. We'd be expecting them to worship the local Canaanite deities like Baal, like Resheph, like Astarte. And that's what we do find in Egypt, is the local Semitic population is worshiping those Canaanite deities.
But they did have.
Well, they had the sense of the God of Abraham being El. Okay? Because that's what that's what God revealed himself as El Shaddai or El Elyon. So, yeah, and Lego David even points out, Joshua said that the Israelites worshiped gods of Egypt while they were there, and that's exactly what they did. The second of all is that there was no cohesive Israel prior to the Exodus. It was the sons of Jacob. You had Amorites there. You had Nubians. You had Egyptians that are part of the Exodus. You had Magi. You had Libyans. There's a huge mixed multitude that gets grafted into the 12 tribes. So there's effectively no Israel prior to the Exodus itself. It's the Exodus that creates the nation of Israel. So you're not going to find before the Bronze Age collapse a lot of documentation, or any documentation, of, say, the Israelites. Now, we do have to say that the Bronze Age collapse, too, we have to understand that the Bronze Age collapse did not occur instantaneous. Yeah, Eric Klein's book of 1177 is very dramatic. It's very dramatic, and it's sometimes you read it and you think, okay, he's making a punctiliar case that 1177, really 1184, that's what he really pegged the year at, is when it all happened. Well, the Bronze Age collapse started a lot before then and continued long after then. So it's more of a season of collapse more than it is a one-off collapse. So even sort of the whole idea of a Bronze Age collapse has to be taken with a certain bit of circumspection, because it's not exactly a collapse. It's more of a demise. Yeah, Jack Ray said 1177 when publishers named the book. That's exactly what it was. It was a decision by the publishers because they thought 1177 was more marketable than 1184. Yeah, well, yeah, publishers end up naming your books, by the way. You don't get to name your books. The publishers name your books. Yeah. No, Juan, you didn't mess up by calling it a collapse. Everyone calls it a collapse. But we do have to be we just have to be cognizant of this, because there are people who really think it's a collapse. That's just like January 1st, 1177. Oops, everything's gone. It's like, and that's just not how it happened. Okay. But during that season of say the decline of the Bronze Age, you're not going to find much in the way of Israelite beliefs because there was no Israel, and Yahweh worship hadn't been brought to them. Now, there's some possibility that we could find something, for example, what's called sometimes the Kenite hypothesis, where the idea was that there was an extant worship of Yahweh in, say, Midian. But we don't have a lot of strong evidence for that quite just yet. There's some interesting suggestions that might be true, and I think it's a pretty good guess. It's definitely a good guess, basically based upon the biblical narrative. But again, more evidence needs to come out to really give that hypothesis a firm because some extra biblical text would go a long ways here. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. I really appreciate it, and it's a good question. It's a good question, and it's one that does, when you take the historical context into account, it makes sense. Okay. Ancient Y2K. See if I pull that up. There it is. Yep. Ancient Y2K. Pretty much the same, too, to be honest. Yeah, it was about as anticlimactic also as real Y2K, as modern one. Oh, boy. Yep. Okay. Reason where we were. There was, but I mean, that was the Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context. Let's actually take that. See if I can pull that up. Hasn't shown up yet. All right. Darkblade asks, is there a title you wanted instead of the Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context? Yeah, there was one. I can't remember what it was at the moment. Yeah, I forget what the working title was. I can look it up though. It was let's see here. What did we originally want to call this thing? Writing. Let's see here. Where's the proposal? Yeah. The original working title of the Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context and illustrated journey was Before the Ark of the Covenant, exploring the Egyptian context of Israelite ritual furniture. So that was Before the Ark of the Covenant was the original working title. Yeah, I think the editors were better on this. I try never to argue with my editors because they're usually right about stuff like marketing. I'm not usually right about stuff like marketing, but they're usually right. So if they've got a perspective on this, I usually go after it just because, it's going to end up better for both of us if I sort of listen. I did push back on some things. Chapter titles. They didn't want me to use humorous chapter titles. I decided to do them anyway.
Chapter titles, nobody would have read it.
Yeah, if they with their chapter titles, nobody. They came up with a more dynamic book title, but I came up with more dynamic chapter titles. So we had I think it became better overall because of the group effort. And frankly, a book is a group effort. Now, the other thing I really pushed back on was the dates. They did not want me to use dates in the book because they thought that this would alienate too many early date readers. And it's like, this is all dateable material. I can't not put the dates in. So I stood my ground on that one, and I said, okay, we have to have the dates. I mean, that's a showstopper. Because, all this stuff is dateable to a specific reign of a king. So, but, they said, okay, well, if you include the dates of the kings, then you have to also write why you hold to that view of the Exodus. It's like, are you just asking me to do that? Okay, I'll take. Yeah, they're telling me to do that. Yeah. So it's like, okay, if you say so. I thought you were worried I was going to alienate all the all the early date readers. You want me to intentionally do this now? Okay, well, let's see how this works. And actually came out quite well, so I actually was very happy with that decision of theirs. So yeah, yeah, but that is the point though. The art spell explicitly makes it connects these artifacts to dates. So you know. So anyway, yep, that was a specific title, and that's what we did. All right, gonna go to the next super chat here. Okay, I'm actually going to take a quick break here just to get more coffee because I've had 2 hours of sleep last night. So I'm running on fumes and caffeine, so I'm going to fill my empty Mr. Empty Conjecture mug, and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Got my mug here. Okay, our next super chat here is from Josh Nichols for $9.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. What is your favorite poetic passages in the Bible and why? Ooh, hadn't thought about that. Hmm. My favorite one is probably Psalm 1. Let me put it up here. I actually really like Psalm 1. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor sit in the path of the sinners, nor sit in the seat of the scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. And he will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. And in whatever he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but they are like chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Still gives me goosebumps every time I read that. Yeah, that one's my favorite. That's my favorite, say, poetic passage. The reason why is because it's a great example of ancient Near Eastern poetry. It's got couplets, and the couplets are the key to understanding poetry. It's got figurative language, simile. It's got contrast. You got the righteous against the wicked. It's the entire package of Israelite poetry in a tiny space. Plus, it speaks to those that the man who studies the word of the Lord will be blessed. And, you know, there's benefits to that constant reading of the scriptures. I also like too that it's realistic. Okay, it'll be like a tree planted by a stream of water, which yields its fruit in season. Now, it won't yield its fruit immediately, but in its season. For everything, there is a season. It's so compact and so well crafted. It's just, as I say, it just brings chills up and down my spine every time I read it. And again, it's just a beautiful, beautiful piece of poetry, as well as being good advice as well. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. That's my Psalm 1. That's my favorite poetic passage in the Bible. Yes, I think that would be okay. That's it. That is a very interesting follow-up question here. Let's take that. What is the oldest psalm in the Bible? Are there any psalms that are more archaic or obviously older words? Yes, there is. And I think, if I'm correct, it's Psalm 90. That's the oldest psalm. Yes, okay. Psalm 90, it's a prayer of Moses. Okay, so this psalm is actually attributed to Moses. So while it's not part of, say, the Pentateuch, it's part of the canon, at least considered by many to be the canon. Now, some have questioned whether or not it was actually written by Moses. It's an old psalm. It's probably the oldest psalm in the Psalter, and it's been, at least traditionally, as well as in this text, ascribed to Moses. So, there you go. That's probably the oldest. So, anyway, thank you very much for that question. It's a really great question, and it was a great follow-up question. Okay. Let's see here. Go to our next super chat. Try to find where I left off. Okay, that's where we left off. It's at 9:43. Okay, line found for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. What is your favorite evidence on the Trinity? Are you talking biblical evidence? Are you talking philosophical evidence? I'm not sure what exactly you mean by that. So I'll give you a piece of both. Okay, how about that? My favorite evidence for, say, the Trinity, and frankly, once you establish a diunity, the Trinity is really sort of a foregone conclusion at that point. So the challenge is, when you look at, say, evidence for the Trinity, is how do you establish that the Father is God and the Son is God, and then finally the Holy Spirit is God. Okay? Now, Juan, why is biblical evidence and philosophical distinct from each other? It's just different methods. Just different methods. That's all. But for biblical evidence, I will go to Isaiah. Here. I think it's 44:6, if I'm not mistaken, but let me just look it up. Yeah. This is, I think, one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the Trinity. Now, you don't get the whole Trinity in any one passage. You have to take multiple passages together. Okay, so for this, and I think this is for me, the most compelling argument for the Trinity. You start with Isaiah 44:6. Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel. Okay, so thus says, that's Yahweh. So Yahweh, King of Israel. Okay, this is this guy speaking it. All right, so and his Redeemer. Now that's interesting right there. The passage here has Redeemer with the masculine possessive pronoun. And he is called the Yahweh of hosts. Okay. And then it says, I am the first, I am the last, and there is no God beside me. Now this is super interesting. If you're looking at this from so you got two people in here named Yahweh. Two people. And they're different. And that difference is made distinct by the possessive pronoun. And they're both speaking at the same time. Okay? So, this is two people speaking in unison. I am the first. And I am the last. Singular first person pronoun. And there is no God besides me. Two persons, one God. Classic Trinitarian definition. Now, we would also have, just to round this off, we would also have to have a verse that says that the Holy Spirit is also God. Okay? After that, you can go to Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5. And this is the 4 to 5. This is the incident of Ananias and Sapphira. And basically, this happened in the early church, where basically Ananias and Sapphira owned a property, and they pledged to sell it and give the proceeds to the church. Well, they didn't give all the money. They basically lied about it. They basically said, okay, hey, we gave you all the property, didn't fetch as much as we thought. Oh, well. And they get called up for this. Okay? And in this little pericope here, starting at verse 3, but Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit? Now, you can't lie to a piece of static electricity. You cannot lie to a force of nature. You can only lie to a person. The Holy Spirit's a person because you can only lie to a person. You can't lie to your pet, really, because he doesn't understand you. The text goes on, to keep back some of the price of the land. Verse 4. While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not under your control? Why is it that you have conceived this deed in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God. So, this passage here establishes that the Holy Spirit is a person and also God. So with this, we have the total package here of the three persons are the one God. So that's my favorite evidence for, say, the Trinity from a biblical perspective. Now, from a philosophical perspective, there's the whole idea of that the three persons solve a particular philosophical problem called basically how can you have the goodness of God without creation? In, say, monolithic monotheism has a particularly problematic portion to it, which is that in a monolithic monotheism, this means that there are no persons of the Trinity, and there are no angels and no demons or any other spirits. Just God. One person God. In a monolithic monotheism, God cannot be good prior to the creation, or without a creation. because God has nothing to you could be good towards. To be good, you need to be able to be good to something. So because there's no relationship within a monolithic monotheism, God is not inherently good. Now, in a monarchical monotheism or a Trinity, what you have is you can have God, the persons of God, being good to each other even without a creation. And that makes God inherently good. So there's a philosophical argument here that suggests that having, though, the attribute of goodness implies Trinity. It implies multiple persons within the divine, within the one God. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Buzzing down here quickly here. I think we're getting close to the end of the super chats. Maybe or maybe not. Who knows? Okay. Juan here for $5 again. Thank you very much for the super chat. Why is there a large disproportion of secular, liberal, mainline Protestant scholars within the biblical academia? Why the lack of evangelical scholars? Okay. Well, let's just say that the secular, liberal, mainline Protestant scholars occupy some of the highest posts. Okay. There isn't actually a lack of evangelical scholars. They just tend to not be in the mainline universities or the largest seminaries. Or I should say divinity schools. They're not really seminaries anymore, let's be honest. But a lot of this comes down to what happened in the modernist fundamentalist debates of the 1930s. What happened in that time was, with liberal scholarship, there was this concerted effort to take over schools, religious schools, churches, basically separate churches from their trust funds. Basically kind of a theological vampirism, where they were sucking the lifeblood out of the donors and trust funds and all that to keep their decrepit theology going because sort of the funds had stopped coming in. So there was a large push to sort of take over the bigger schools. This led to a lot of, say, evangelical scholars leaving those institutions because they were driven out and starting their own schools. This is how we got, say, schools like Dallas Theological Seminary, TEDS to a large extent, even though it existed before. It was revolutionized because of this sort of move. A lot of those evangelical scholars came into TEDS, and So anyway, there was a. So that's why, but because of this too, because they are in the bigger, more prestigious posts, they do tend to get much more, say, press than, say, scholars who are in, say, smaller institutions. It's a matter of who's got the biggest megaphone, essentially. So, and in many ways, the number of evangelical scholars outnumber the secular ones by sheer numbers. They just don't have that same presence. Because frankly, there's more evangelicals getting into this than there are, say, liberals. But it's also true too that, you know, you can drown out the voice if you've got the megaphone. So, oh yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. So, I mean, it's absolutely true that I haven't been able to. My producer brought up here that I haven't been able to publish certain articles within liberal scholarship because it's just, you know, it leads to conclusions that they don't like. So because they own the presses and the biggest megaphones, you know, there's limits to what you can do. So it's really not. I mean, if you look at how many, say, evangelical schools there are out there, there's like hundreds of them, thousands of them. But they're smaller in size. They're smaller in size. They're less prestigious. They're underfunded. There's a lot of problems. There's a lot of problems that challenges that evangelical scholars face that their liberal secular counterparts don't. So, you know, that's going to influence things a lot. Like, for example, travel stipends. Travel stipends. You know, here's the thing. You know, when I do academic conferences, and I'm after 3 years, I'm finally going to be resuming my going to academic conferences this year. You know, if you are part of a big liberal academic institution, you get a travel stipend. You know, they pay for you to attend these conferences. They pay your hotel, they pay your flight, they pay your meals. No, they don't even pay for some of the books, yeah. But, you know, in my case, it's all out of pocket. It always has been always out of pocket. So again, I want to thank our donors who basically help us to get the latest and greatest information that we can share with you. Because that's what happens is I go to these conferences and I learn. And then I come back and I share what I learned. And the cycle goes on. So, you know, there's challenges. There's definitely challenges. And, you know, these conferences aren't cheap. They're expensive. And they're held in expensive locations. You know, so, you know,
because people build fancy. We prefer hotels.
I mean, a lot of scholars do treat this as a little bit of a oh, okay. Juan's just said, I agree, but I don't see it in the Society of Biblical Literature or in the top. Oh, yeah. Oh, it's there. Oh, it's so in SBL. It's just woke. I mean, you talk about bias in SBL. Holy crow. They are an incredibly biased organization. Incredibly woke. You know. So, you know, it's definitely there. So, but SBL is the largest theological organization because it also doesn't have any. I mean, Jack Ray identity politics. Oh, you have no idea. I won't go into detail, but if you get the emails from SBL, you are fully aware that they are right now celebrating the month everybody in the identity politics community is celebrating right now. And you don't dare go against it if you're part of that organization. So there's no such thing as theological or ethical or moral stances within that organization. That'll get you kicked out. That'll get you really kicked out. Not that I don't know that firsthand. So yeah, you do get, again, they've got the control of the pub presses. They have control of the biggest schools and the biggest megaphones. So that is going to make it seem like there's a disproportionate amount of these scholars. However, the evangelical scholars outnumber them, honestly. There's just more of them. So again, it's going to It's going to depend. And you do find the journals. You can if you source out the evangelical journals, they are out there. So, um, you know, and frankly, a lot of schools still publish their own private journals because of this. Like TEDS. TEDS publishes their own journal. Now, I haven't gotten it in ages, but I know they have their own journal. ETS has its own journal. So a lot of these schools do publish their own journals, but they tend to be very much niche publications. So anyway, I want to thank you for that super chat. I hope that explains what's going on here. And it is unfortunate that we're not necessarily dealing with a plurality of scholarship here, but a scholarship with a particular that's privileged with a certain voice. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, Daniel, Roller of the Logos for $9.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Sponsoring Lego David's Ancient Israelite King dress question. Okay. Let's see here. Let me find it. King's dress. Where you see it? Is it right? Was it right above it? Looking for this question. King's dress by Lego David. Yeah, if you could repeat that question, that would be great. Because we're not. You got a lot of questions here. I'm not quite finding it yet. So if you can make this easier for us, that would be fantastic. Yeah, I'm not finding this. All right, here he's got it at the bottom. Lovely. Okay, it's probably just going to take a minute here to pop up. But, okay, I can read the question right now. What did the ancient Israelite kings dress like? What did their royal garments look like? Did they wear crowns? Okay, it's popped up here. Here we go. All right. They did wear a kind of crown. Now, it was more of a headband. So the crown wasn't like a big pointed thingy like you see in British monarchy. It was more of a kind of a headband that went around, and a turban went underneath. A kind of a cloth went underneath it. Okay, so that was sort of the crown style of ancient Israelite kings. Not a tiara. We actually see a king dressed in the Shalmaneser inscription, or the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, where there's a picture there of Jehu. And he's dressed in robes from basically the neck down to the feet. He's wearing sandals. And he's got that, say, headbound type crown with that sort of headdress underneath it. Okay, so that seems to be the typical typical way that Israelite kings dressed. It is different. It is definitely different. One of the things we do seem to notice about Israelite fabric. There's something, it's actually a really neat detail we find this on the Shalmaneser the Third obelisk. We also find this on some ivories that have come from Egypt that seem to portray Israelites, which is, say, amongst Israelites, clothing with flower patterns on it seem to be very popular, which is very interesting. Men are wearing these robes with flowers on them. So, quite interesting and quite attractive, actually. There's, again, we do see that, now, apparently, headbands were quite common and not restricted to kings, although the king's headband would be more ornate and more like a crown. But we did see that there were some average people, too, that also wore headbands. So, in the case of the king, his headband would probably be out of gold. So that would be the sort of the differentiation. It wouldn't be a fabric headband or a leather one. It'd be a gold one. So that would be the difference. Yeah, Macanique, Hawaiian shirt style. Yep. Rosettes. They were rosettes. Yeah, like Weird Al. Well, hey, if you're king, you can be tacky. Who's gonna argue? Okay, so anyway, that's how the kings of ancient Israel dressed. So again, a kind of headdress or turban with a headband crown, and then a full robe often with rosettes and sandals. So anyway, thank you very much for that question. I also want to thank the sponsor of this channel, this question. It's a good question, and I think that was very interesting. All right. So, again, thank you for Daniel Rohr of the Logos for sponsoring that previous question. Jack Ray, $5 for the coffee fund. Thank you so much. I love my coffee. The caffeine must flow. Thank you very much for the super chat. Really appreciate it, and I love. As I said, right now it's the only thing keeping me upright right now. It's the coffee. Again, thank you for your generosity. It's been really helpful for this channel. We couldn't do this without you, so we so appreciate the financial support. Okay. Okay, we'll take that one. Let me just mark my timestamp here. Okay, go to the bottom here. Take this question here from Lego David. Even though it doesn't have a Q and a colon on it, it attracted my producer's attention, so we'll take this one. Was Joseph's colorful cloth common or something very special? The pattern was special, but colorful cloth was common. So, here's the thing. Every family weaved their cloth in a different pattern. Okay, we see, for example, at the tombs at Beni Hassan, there is a scene where there are Levantine Asiatics. They're coming in to work the mines, and they're dressed in colorful tunics. A lot of them are. And the patterns on each one is different. So there does seem to be, the fact that Joseph had a colorful tunic was very common back then. A lot of Levantine Semites had that. This is why it's not something distinct to him. Now, however, The pattern on each individual tunic might have been distinct. Again, that's part of the fabric maker's craft, that they would make a different color and banding and pattern on each tunic. Yeah, you had this in the Middle Ages. This has been, I mean, these are all handmade fabrics. These are all handmade fabrics. And yes, they've got a loom, but, you know, they've learned to use that loom to make specialty fabrics. So each fabric, each tunic could be individually crafted and show individual patterning. This is why, say, Jacob was able to recognize Joseph's tunic as opposed to any other Asiatic, because the patterning is distinct. So while the fact he had a colorful tunic isn't unique, the pattern on that tunic would have been unique. So anyway, thank you very much for that question. Very interesting question. Okay, and back to back to 1057 here. Okay. Oh. Shot it a bit. There we go. All right, Daniel, Roar of the Lion, or sorry, Roar of the Logos for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Also, Lego David's Pharaoh Neko question. All right, let's see if I can find this one this time. An Egyptian coffee? Not really. Not ancient Egyptian, anyway. I mean, there's modern Egyptian coffee. But we have to understand that coffee grows high in high elevations. So you need high elevations, and Egypt doesn't have a place where they can grow coffee. Yeah, he's the... Okay, Lego David, if you can repeat that question, much appreciated. So, yeah, the Egyptians didn't have coffee. They started growing coffee in, say, the Middle Ages because they banned alcohol. Islam banned alcohol, so they needed coffee instead. All right, do we get one yet? Yeah, so, you know, the ancient Egyptians didn't have coffee. They had beer. They didn't drink hot drinks. The Egyptians didn't drink hot drinks until the Islamic period. Yeah, Jan Alkovic. Grow coffee on the pyramids. Okay. All right, we got the question here. Okay, we'll start reading it and then it'll show up in a moment here. In 2 Chronicles 35, Neko tells Josiah that King Josiah, that God is on his side and he shouldn't oppose him. What does he actually mean? Okay. That's a good question. Let's pull that up. All right. Get the Bible up here. 2 Chronicles 35. Okay. And it's down towards his death. And it's verse 21 here. I'll start verse 20. After all this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, Neko, king of Egypt, came up to make war at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out to engage him. But Neko sent messengers to him, saying, "What have we to do with each other, O king of Judah? I am not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war, and God has ordered me to hurry. Stop for your own sake from interfering with God who is with me, that he may not destroy you. Okay. And the question here is, what's he talking about here? Okay. Because we know, for example, Neko is a polytheist. Okay. He's a polytheist. He's a worshiper of the Egyptian gods. Now, that said, that didn't prevent Egyptians from sometimes using the term God in the singular. They would sometimes say, God told me this, even though they're polytheists. And when that happens, it's sometimes not clear which God or told was said to be responsible for that oracle. So the Egyptians did sometimes use God in the singular here when talking about oracles. And what we have here is a kind of oracle. Neko receives an oracle from a deity. And basically, what's happening in this passage here is Neko the Second, and this is Neko the Second. He's headed up to Carchemish to help his ally, the Assyrians, fight against the Babylonians. Okay. And Josiah is playing regional politics here. He's playing a dangerous game of brinksmanship. He wants to prevent Neko from getting to Carchemish so that the Assyrians get clobbered by the Babylonians. Well, they're ultimately going to get clobbered anyway, but what happens here is that Neko sends a message to, he's not rampaging, he's not pillaging cities as he goes here. He's on a straight path. And he sends a messenger to Josiah, and he says, what do we have to do with each other? We don't have a conflict here. They back off, man. And he says, I am not coming against you today, but against the house at which I am war with. And God ordered me to hurry. Okay, so now this raises the question of, which God is this? Who's he talking about here when he says God ordered him? Is it one of the Egyptian gods? Is this Yahweh? Did Yahweh speak directly to King Neko? Is this basically an reception history by the authors of Chronicles? Basically, he might have said, hey, Amun-Re told me that, he told me to hurry. And the writer of Chronicles may have just taken out the name Amun-Re and basically said, okay, this is God who told him. So we're not exactly sure who is the God here being referred to and under what context. As I said, we do know that Neko was a polytheist, because almost all the Egyptian kings were polytheists, except Akhenaten. The whole matter, though, of who is this voice coming from is definitely very interesting and very suggestive, and frankly is right. God was on Neko's side, just not in the way he thought, because he's going to go up to Carchemish, and he's going to find the Assyrians in total disarray. Okay, he's going to find them totally in disarray. So, they're not great allies. Essentially, the whole Assyrian Empire's fallen apart. But Neko has to get up there and to be part of the debacle. So, he's going to make it up there one way or the other. And God's going to facilitate that one way or the other. So, Josiah here did not consult with the Urim and Thummim. He didn't do the proper oracles. He just sort of took it on his own initiative to go to battle against Neko, and that was the wrong move. So, essentially what Neko is saying here is he's received an oracle. He's received a divine word from a deity. And because he's received this divine word, God is on his side. So that's what he's saying here to Josiah. And Josiah just blows it off, essentially. So anyway, I thank you very much for the super chat, sponsor the super chat. Very much appreciate it. This is a good question, and a lot of people have asked this. So anyway, it's a great question. Thank you so much for the super chat. Okay. Okay. Juan here for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Why hasn't there been efforts for evangelicals, non-liberals to become part of the institutions and influence academia from within, posts and journals? Oh, it's difficult. I'll just say this: it's really, really difficult to do that sort of to infiltrate from the inside. It's, I mean, these sorts of every academic institution has its own culture. Okay. In some of these cultures, you can't speak of religion. Let's be honest about that. You know, even in some places like departments of religious studies, yeah, there's departments of religious studies that are occupied only by atheists. You know, that's a really hard thing to change from the inside. You know, because you're dealing with dominance here, a hierarchy of dominance. If it comes out that you are a Christian, you know, you might not make tenure. You know, that's going to be a huge issue. You know, if you're an academic and you want to be established, so you can write what you want to write, you've got to sort of, you know, duck and cover. Yeah.
You're in a.
Yeah, and my producers point out here is the problem with duck and cover is once you get tenure, which takes 7 years, you've now developed a life pattern of ducking and covering. So you at that point never make the courageous choice because they've got you now on this sort of reward cycle. So you've now been rewarded with tenure, but now you're also going to get financial rewards. So, you know, your bonuses are going to be based upon how the dean of the department feels about you and how your colleagues feel about you. And if they find out you're one of these scandalous Christians, you might not ever see a bonus ever again, or even further academic promotion. You'll get the worst classes. You'll get all the scut work. You'll have you'll be put on every committee that people don't want to be on. Yeah, you know, you'll get, well, I happen to like evening classes. But yeah, you'll get the evening classes. Yeah, you'll get the evening classes. You'll get the early morning classes, which is worse. You'll get the 5 a.m. classes.
Yes, they do have those for the work.
Yeah. And yes, there are definitely 5 a.m. classes these days, and they're just horrible. I hated 5 a.m. classes. Okay. But yeah, that's you'll get the worst jobs. You'll get the worst jobs. And you'll get the scut work. You'll be overwhelmed with the tedium, like the large survey classes. You'll be stuck teaching nothing but undergrads, probably first-year students for the rest of your natural life. Jan Alkovic, 5 a.m. classes, is that for real? Yeah, that's for real. Yeah, that's for real. In fact, I used to attend some of them because when I first few years of my graduate program, my master's degree, my first master's degree, I was also doing a full-time job. I had a career job as well as going to seminary. And one of the ways I got around this is I'd take a 5 a.m. class, it'd go for 3 hours, get out by 8, and I'm at work by 8:30. So, yeah, that happens. It happens. It's there. It's real. But there are some institutions that'll basically put you on 5 a.m. classes because that's what they want. Because you've rocked the boat. You've rocked the boat by believing something that's not popular with the local consensus. So, and it's very, very true in, say, a lot of major institutions. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. It's unfortunate. It's just plain unfortunate. People have tried to change these institutions, and it's like moving a massive steamboat in another direction. It's got a momentum and it's going in a certain direction, and it's very difficult to change that direction once it's got that momentum going. So, you can do only what you can do. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. I understand that from the outside, it might appear that you could come in and change it. There's a diminishing return, though, to it. We tried. Look, we tried. And, we got kind of eaten alive because of it. So God opened YouTube instead. Fantastic. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, we got a $5 Australian super chat here from Benjamin. I see a question from him below here. So I think he meant this to be part of that question. So we'll take the question here. And he says, has the Battle of Gog, Ezekiel 38, 39, 16 already taken place, or is it yet to come, or was it symbolic? Okay. What we're talking about here is apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature is a subset of a prophetic literature. So it is meant to symbolize the last battle, last rebellion against God. So I don't think we're done with rebellion yet, honestly. But, I don't think it's taken place yet. I know there are some newspaper exegetes right now that are saying the Ukraine-Russian war is this battle, but no. No, I don't think so. Yeah, it could be wrong, but I doubt it, because it can't be, because, again, this battle is the last battle. It's the battle before the consummation. So I don't trust the newspaper exegetes because they get so much stuff wrong anyway. Yeah, they've been wrong every time. They've been wrong every time. So I'm not going to trust them again here. But again, the circumstances of which the Battle of Gog is supposed to occur is it's mankind's final rebellion against God. So now whether or not is it symbolic or is it yet to come? Well, is it yet to come? Yes, it's yet to come. Whether or not it's symbolic, that's a different question. And also it's going to depend what you mean by symbolic. Is it symbolic of a real battle? Is it supposed to represent a real battle, or is it symbolic of a general man-wide rebellion? Don't know. Apocalyptic literature unveils its secrets reluctantly, and it reveals it as it reveals its secrets as it's recontextualized. So every reader in every generation is going to read this literature in a slightly different way and recontextualize it for their own situation. And this is normal for apocalyptic literature. apocalyptic literature is almost always recontextualized to the current readership. So this is one of those situations where, of actually a very rare situation in biblical literature, where the context is not the cultural context of the original reference is not the only valid reading. Contextualized readings can be valid because the literature is designed to be read that way. So with that said, is it possible that this is a symbol? Yeah. Is it possible it's a real battle? Yes. How do we know? We can't. Not yet. The only thing we can tell right now is that it's at the end. That's what it's designed to be. It's the last rebellion. So I don't think, absolutely don't think that that the battle's taking place. We're not quite at the end just yet, although it sometimes feels like it. That's a different matter. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat, and very, very much appreciate it. Oh, he repeats it again. I didn't see that. Okay, so you did repeat that in a super chat. I mean, your first super chat, we would have looked for the question underneath, and since we saw it, we took it anyway. But I want to thank you for that second super chat. We really appreciate your support, and we're grateful that you were here tonight and that you could participate. So anyway, thank you so much. Really appreciate your support. Okay. So anyway, that's the end of the super chats. We're going to now take a couple of non-super chats, and then we're going to call it a night. So, I'll have to see where. Do you know where that is roughly? Okay. Can you copy and paste it back into the live stream so I don't have to hunt all over the place for it? Well, while you do that, I will go and look for some non-super chats. Oh. Jack Ray for $2. Last super chat. No, it's not up yet. Okay. There we go. Last super chat. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Every super chat is appreciated. So thank you so very much for your generous support tonight. It really helps. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna find those. Let's find some juicy non-super chat questions here. All right, let's see here. Okay. All right. This was a question from Mechanique. Is it likely that ancient Egyptians considered frogs to be a type of fish? The Ipaware Papyrus has a line about treading water like a fish, and in my opinion, that sounds more like more frog-like behavior. Okay. It probably is frog-like behavior. The Ipaware papyrus is poetic. Okay? So this is not a statement of biology. So we have to keep that in mind. There's a lot of amphibole in Ipaware. So we got to be kind of aware of that. So they didn't consider frogs to be a type of fish, although they did consider tadpoles to be a kind of fish. And that's not surprising, considering how tadpoles looked. Okay, so a tadpole was considered a type of fish, but a frog wasn't. But there was also that sort of idea of, say, magical transformation of the frogs. So one of the interesting things about Egyptian view of frogs, and one of the reasons why it was associated with the goddess Heket, goddess of magic, is because it transformed itself from a fish to a frog. So when you think about this, this makes a lot of sense from a magical worldview. So yeah, there was a lot of there is a lot of culturally cramped stuff put into the idea of frogs, and they would also occasionally breed tremendous amounts of them. So you know that they go from nothing to now you got a ton of frogs hanging around. So again, all this is associated with magic and the idea that, you know, these are just magical beings. So yeah, there is this idea that frogs come from fish, but again, the idea is their assumption here is a tadpole is a fish. So anyway, thank you very much for that question. It's a very interesting question, Mechanique, and that's sort of the cultural view of what frogs were in ancient Egypt. Okay, I see here another one here from Jan Alkovic, which we'll take here. I don't think it was answered. Yeah, I don't think it went through. I didn't see a super chat from you, and just take coolly, just stick it at your question in the chat here. We'll grab it. Don't worry about it. Okay, Jan Alkovic here has a question here. Today you mentioned Yahweh being a form of to be, which is Hayeh in Hebrew. Okay. Now, the third person form is Yahweh, which is similar to Yahweh, but lacks the vav. Why the connection then? It's called a secondary tense. Okay? It's called a secondary tense. Now, the fact is that Hebrew has two tenses for the verb to be. One that's reserved for the divine name, and another one that isn't. So the issue here is that secondary tense, that Yahweh, is that it becomes reserved. It starts off as the verb to be, and we see this connotation throughout the text. And frankly, Christopher Rolston agrees with this assessment. So, and then he's the one that points out that yod he vav he is the form of the verb to be. It's just a secondary tense of the verb. Now, we don't know what the original meaning of that secondary tense was. Oftentimes, when you have a secondary tense in linguistics, it usually has a slightly different meaning. Like, for example, there's a strongly used secondary tense in Egyptian. When used, that secondary tense is basically implies a even though relationship, or just because of relationship. So just because X, secondary tense, therefore this happens. Or even though X happened, this is the result, or something like that. So that tends to be the construction of the secondary tense in Egyptian. But in Hebrew, this second form of to be seems to have been a secondary tense. And it could even been that this was a functional, widespread secondary tense in Amoritic. We're not quite sure yet. It's going to be interesting to find out more if we get more Amoritic texts. But that's sort of my thinking on this, is that this is a secondary tense that originated in Amoritic and then became associated with the divine name. So that's why the connection. There's really very little doubt that these are related in some way, both Haye and Yahweh. So linguists don't doubt this one. Just, however, it does seem that for some reason the secondary tense was no longer used by the time classical Hebrew came onto the scene. Now, linguists might find something that really sort of points out that the secondary tense survived in some other way. That could always happen, and it'd be an interesting thing to investigate. But for the most part, most linguists now believe that at least that secondary tense was made obsolete, essentially. So anyway, I hope that answered the question. Thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. Lego David, I have heard a theory that the conquest of Canaan may have been not of the Exodus Israelites alone, but that they joined forces with the local Hapiru Grua tribes. Is there any support by any of this? Not really. The only support, well, the problem is that the Israelites infiltrate the cities and basically take them over. So they drive out the inhabitants and they take over the cities bit by bit. So, the closest we get to this is actually the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites end up joining the Israelites by basically trickery, but, they join. But they're not Hapiru. Hapiru are basically outcasts, bums, mercenaries, and I don't think there's a lot of evidence for this. Now, I do think that we see, for example, Hapiru, play a lot in, say, the Amarna period, but again, they're being used as mercenaries. So, it's possible. It's possible, could be, but there's not any evidence for it. That's the problem. Is it lacks evidence. So. So it could, as I say, conceivably could be, but again, we're at this point up in the territory of speculation. So, thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciated. Okay. Jack Race for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Sponsor a Lego David question. I thought you said that was going to be the last super chat of the night. I know. All right. Okay, I see it. Lego David. He says, "Is it possible that Akhenaten's monotheism was inspired by the beliefs that the Israelites that were in Egypt at that time?" No. Not possible. The reason why it's not possible is because Akhenaten's too early. Akhenaten reigns in the 1340s. The Exodus takes place in the 1260s, roughly 1265. So you're talking about 80 years of difference here between Akhenaten, 80, 90 years of difference between Akhenaten and the Exodus. So the other thing is that Akhenaten really didn't believe in a monotheism. He believed in a pantheism. He had a monolatry. You worship the Aten, but there were other gods that manifested as part of the Aten. So he really believed in a pantheism, but it was a monolatrous pantheism. Monolatry meaning you worship only one god. So, but again, the chronology here won't work out. It just plain old won't work out. Well, yes, but they weren't monotheist. And Lego David replies, but didn't the Israelites come into Egypt around 1600 BC under Joseph? They did, but they weren't monotheist. And that's the problem here. So there's no monotheism there to influence Akhenaten. It pretty much by the time around, say, even just like one generation after Joseph, they're already full polytheists. Okay? And henotheists. They're already worshiping Baal. Because the temple of Baal had already been established, will be soon established at that point. So, yeah. They're already worshiping Canaanite deities. So, there's no monotheism here to inspire Akhenaten, simply put. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Okay. Our next question here is from Benjamin. Oops. And he asks, let's see here. I was once told that the book of Revelation was coded for its time to evade Emperor Nero 666 and send a message to the Christians. Since Gog and Magog are talked about, how much of it is prophetic? Okay. I don't think I have some issues with the whole idea of this being Gamatria to spell out Nero. Yeah, could be. But I've got some issues with it. Here's my thought when I go through the book of Revelation. It's all Old Testament symbolism. Almost all of it. There's very little in the book of Revelation that isn't Old Testament symbolism. And the fact is, we do find 666 mentioned in the book, or in the Old Testament. And it's a reference to Solomon. And it's his acquisition of 666 talents of gold in the first year of his reign. So when it talks about, say, the number, you'll be able to identify him by a number. It's basically a kind of symbolic marker that this is a king that's going to rise quickly out of nothing. He's going to go from basically rags to riches. He gets a lot of power real fast. So it tells you the style of the rise of, say, the Antichrist. Now, I don't doubt that the Emperor Nero was a type of Antichrist, and that's a still possible meaning here that this is encoding to indicate a type of Antichrist. But I also don't take the preterist view here that this was talking directly about Nero, because Nero's been dead and gone, decades by the time this is written. Dead and gone decades. I mean, he's dead and gone even before the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So, I've got some issues with this this kind of reading. And I find, say, the contextualized reading out of, say, the Old Testament to be more compelling myself. Now, this is apocalyptic. Feel free to disagree. Everyone's going to have a different opinion on this. I'm totally cool with that. I'm not going to slag on that other reading, but I don't find it personally as compelling. So, Anyway, thank you very much for that super chat. I can look that up, that verse up for you, which is, if you want to reference it, it is, let's see here. It is 1 Kings 10:14, by the way. Now the weight of gold which came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. Besides that, from the traders and the wares of the merchants of all the kings of the Arab and the governors of the country. It's also repeated in 2 Chronicles 9:13. So, it's one of those repeated passages. Again, I've never seen any newspaper exegete ever comment on that. So, it's like, it'd be very, I wish again, people were more thorough about this, but in fact, I haven't even seen any New Testament comment, like basically people who are experts in the book of Revelation comment on this. So, anyway, I want to thank you very much for the super chat. It's an interesting question. Thank you very much for the question, and I hope that helped. Oh, you're most welcome. Let's see here very quickly. He says, "Thank you so much for answering my questions. Very enlightening." Well, it's our pleasure. That's what we do here, is we answer questions. Okay, and it's almost midnight here, so we're going to take that last super chat and... Jack Ray for $2. That was a question? Last super chat? Yes, it was. Yeah. All right, and we're probably going to call it a night at this point because we've actually taken a lot of non-super chats tonight, more than we usually take. So, we're going to wrap it up here. It's midnight, and I have got to get to bed because I got to get up at 6 a.m. tomorrow. So, anyway, I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. I want to thank our super chatters who basically keep us fed and clothed in this stylish Ancient Egypt and the Bible swag. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters who keep the lights on, who keep the equipment working and functional, and who don't get nearly enough thanks, but we are happy to be able to start producing content just for our Patreon supporters. We also want to thank our regular subscribers. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so you don't miss any of our content. We also want to thank them because they, continue to watch and comment, like, and feed the algorithm. And also share our links on other social media platforms. That helps gets the message out and helps expose new audiences to our content. So with that said, thank you very much for joining with us tonight. It's been a great night. Great questions. Take care, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Good night, everyone.